Chapter 256. Just as the nobles in the diplomatic mission were having their own thoughts, the carriages had already arrived at the last relay station on the outskirts of the capital. Fan Xian sighed as he looked at the ceremonial guards and the array of troops placed there. He had no choice but to put off the issue of Lady Shun until after they entered the capital. If it was just him, there was absolutely no need for this woman to stay. It was just that Lady Shun had a friendship with the great princess, and Sir Yen Bingyun seemed to feel somewhat apologetic towards her. Officials from the Board of Rites, Honglu Temple, and Taichung Temple were already waiting there. Seeing the diplomatic mission's convoy slowly approach, they tidied up their clothes and respectfully welcomed the Princess of Northern Qi from the carriage. Fan Xian thought for a moment and called Gouda over. He had him take 2 tiger guards to guard the princess carriage. He could not let the court officials discover that there was another woman in the carriage. Actually, given his current position of power, there was no need to be so careful. "Master Fan, you must have had a hard journey." "Master Fan, you have greatly increased the prestige of the country. His Majesty is very pleased. Now that you have returned to the capital, I'm afraid you will soon be given an important position." "Old Hu, you are wrong. Master Fan is now." Amidst a wave of flattery, Fan Xian entered the relay station, escorted by the officials. The Princess of Northern Qi was resting in the inner chambers. The procession to welcome the head envoy was even grander. If one did not know Fan Xian's identity, they would certainly be puzzled as to why the Qin court officials were so respectful to such a young, middle-ranked official. Fan Xian smiled and raised his hands to return the greetings of the officials around him. He was not annoyed, but he felt a little anxious. He looked around and found that he knew most of the officials who had come to greet him. Some were his colleagues from Taichung Temple, and some were nominal subordinates of the Chamberlain of Dependencies when negotiating with Northern Qi. Only the officials from the Ministry of Rites were respectful with a trace of fear. He understood the reason for this. After all, Guo Yu had been brought down by him. As soon as he sat down and took a sip of tea, he asked, "What is the next procedure? Is there an edict from the palace, and when can the diplomatic mission enter the capital?" Without waiting for the officials to reply, he laughed at himself and said, "I am the head envoy, but I am still not clear about the process." The officials of the Board of Rites had finally gotten a chance to get close to him, and they did not want to miss it. One of the vice-counselors hurriedly replied, "Do not worry, Master Fan. The Board of Rites has arranged everything. The palace has already made arrangements, and everything is in order." Another subordinate from the office of the Grand Herald said, "His Majesty knows that the officials of the diplomatic mission have been away from home for a long time and are very homesick. Thus, he did not issue an official edict. He only ordered the diplomatic mission to enter the capital. After you enter the capital, you will first go to the palace." Before he could finish speaking, an official wearing a 4th-rank official uniform walked in from outside, and the officials in the room hurried to welcome him. Fan Xian fixed his eyes on him and went up to him with a smile. He patted him on the shoulder and said, "Sir Ren, why are you here?" The newcomer was Ren Shaoan, the vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald, a disciple of Fan Xian's father-in-law. Seeing that Fan Xian was safe and sound, Ren Shaoan was relieved. He smiled bitterly and said, "The marriage of the princess of the kingdom of Qi is a major event. If I, a laborer of the Taichung Temple, did not come, then there is no need for the imperial censorate to come. I have no choice but to resign." Fan Xian smiled, but he was puzzled. He knew that the diplomatic mission would arrive today, so why did this vice minister come so late? He greeted the officials in the room, and then pulled Ren Shaoan out of the door. "What is this all about?" he asked. Ren Shaoan knew that although this man in front of him was young, his temperament was soft and gentle, and he had overthrown so many officials in the capital. He did not know whether or not he should say anything. but Prime Minister Lin Ruofu had already retired and returned to his hometown. The Lin family could only rely on Fan Manor in the capital. Considering the two sides, he could not help but hesitate. "Sir Fan," he said, "what is it that you ask about?" Fan Xian stared into his eyes. "I am not an idiot. The return of the diplomatic mission to the capital is a major event. When we left Shangjing, the court of Northern Qi should be aware of the scale of the ceremony. A princess is in the diplomatic mission, so why are all the officials there to welcome her? Where is Xian Qiwu? And where are the officials from the Board of Rites? The princess is getting married, and the palace should at least send some old servants. You are a man of the Taichung Temple, so you are in charge of royal affairs. If I did not ask you, who would I ask?" Ren Shaoan laughed bitterly and said, "Today, unfortunately, Xian Qiwu went there. The elders of the Ministry of Rites also went there. Fan Xian, don't blame me. I came here in a hurry because I offended them." "Which side is that?" Fan Xian was slightly surprised. Ren Shaoan continued to laugh bitterly. "The Great Prince is also returning to the capital today. He has set up camp less than 3 miles away from you. So this is too much of a coincidence." The people from the Board of Rites, the Bureau of Military Affairs, and the Ministry of War are all there, so the diplomatic mission is naturally quieter. After saying this, he continued, "Fan Xian, we are friends, and I am not afraid to say it out loud. You are also a person with a crystal heart. Do you really care about these superficial formalities?" Fan Xian now understood what was going on. He laughed and shook his head. "I just want to get back to the capital. But the princess is a princess, after all. If the court treats her poorly, it will incite gossip, and it will not be good." He finally understood why the reception of the diplomatic mission was so much weaker. After all, it was the great prince who had military power. The court officials would naturally rush there. Even if it was to flatter him, they had to flatter him. Fan Xian waved his hand to stop Ren Shaoan's explanation. He asked curiously, "The edict at the beginning of the year clearly stated that the great prince would only lead his troops back to the capital when the grass was growing in autumn. It is only the beginning of autumn, why is he back?" "It is said that the Empress Dowager misses her eldest grandson." Ren Shaoan gave a meaningful laugh. "So they set off early. The Western Army is stationed in Dingzhou. This time, the Great Prince is leading 200 soldiers back to the capital." Fan Xian shook his head. "I don't know if those officials from the Board of Rites have learned from the Guo family. The diplomatic mission is entering the capital, and the prince is returning to the palace. With so many people, did they not know to make arrangements to send a letter along the way? No matter the route, it is not impossible to delay it for a day or two. Now they are all crowded on the road outside the city. What do we do? The Board of Rites and Honglu Temple sent letters to you along the way, telling the diplomatic mission to slow down. Who would have thought that the diplomatic mission would not rest for a day, and would go straight back to the capital? That is why they are all crowded together." Fan Xian laughed and said nothing. The diplomatic mission was traveling thousands of miles back to the capital. This was his original intention. Rong Yirong, when the arrangements are made, the diplomatic mission will enter the city in 2 days. What do you think? Ren Shaoan looked at him carefully. He didn't know how long this man had been in the Overwatch Council, and whether he had inherited Director Chen Pingping's arrogance. "The new minister of the Board of Rites is too embarrassed to come to the diplomatic mission," he said. "So he asked me to pass on a message. Damn it, I'm in a hurry to go home and hug my wife." Fan Xian was familiar with him, and his words were a bit presumptuous. "You want to wait 2 days? Be careful that when you come to the manor in the future, my wife will punish you." Ren Shaoan's forehead was covered in sweat. Of course, he knew what kind of person Fan Xian's wife was. Although she was always ill, her background was incomparably deep. Fan Xian did not want to fight over these things with the great prince, whom he had never met. Furthermore, he had no right to do so. He smiled and patted Ren Shaoan on the shoulder. "Don't worry. I won't make things difficult for you." He thought for a moment, then said, "I will go and report to the princess, in case there is a rift between the two of them before they even meet. As officials, we have to explain." Ren Shaoan was dumbfounded. He watched Fan Xian walk towards the room where the princess was temporarily resting. He thought, "What are you playing at? You don't say anything. So what if you drag things out for 2 days? If the princess doesn't want to be at a disadvantage, then I'm afraid your explanation will become a provocation." How could he know that Fan Xian, this mischievous fellow, was in a hurry to go home? As for how the great prince and princess would fight, he couldn't be bothered to care. Ren Shaoan was wiping his sweat as he waited outside. He noticed another fourth-rank official running in from outside the courier station. The official's back was drenched in sweat. It was early autumn and it was hot and dry. He was at a disadvantage running from both sides. It was Exhilarating, the vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald. Seeing Ren Shaoan there, he cupped his hands in greeting and said in a low voice, "You're early." Ren Shaoan knew that Exhilarating was close to the Eastern Palace. Originally, they were not close, but after the Prime Minister's departure, the bureaucracy had placed Ren Shaoan on Fan Xian's side. To the princes, there was no such thing as intimacy, so the two of them had become more familiar. He jokingly scolded, "With Master Fan here, if I didn't come, the princess would scold me. You, on the other hand, have always been close to him. Why have you only come now?" Exhilarating was a little surprised. He smiled bitterly and said, "Master Fan is not that kind of person." Thinking of the absurdity of the day, he couldn't help but laugh at himself. The great prince and the diplomatic mission have arrived outside the capital at the same time. I don't think the people from the Board of Rights know what to do. Even the officials of the 3 houses, 6 departments, and 4 temples are confused. Which side should they welcome first? Hearing this, Ren Shaoan and Exhilarating fell silent at the same time. The scene was a little strange. After a long time, the two of them coughed twice. The reason for this was because they realized that their conversation just now had placed the great prince and the diplomatic mission on the same level of importance. Could it be that after Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council and gained a reputation for himself, he could be mentioned in the same breath as an army-wielding prince? Exhilarating shook his head and threw this absurd thought to the back of his mind. But he knew that since the officials were so troubled, they had subconsciously placed Fan Xian in a very high position. Well, Master Fan had only been in the capital for a little over a year, and he had already done so much. It was indeed a little surprising. Although there was a foreign princess in the diplomatic mission, the officials' true intentions were naturally to curry favor with the Fan family and the Overwatch Council. "Master Fan, you didn't say anything when you didn't see me earlier, did you?" Exhilarating asked carefully. Ren Shaoan shook his head. Exhilarating felt a little more at ease. He smiled and said, "Actually, for the great prince to arrive first, I have to greet him on behalf of the Eastern Palace. After all, Master Fan is an official, and he has his own status. I don't have any status." Fan Xian walked over and greeted Exhilarating. "I can't believe you were so straightforward when you drank with me, calling me brother. I've been abroad for months, and you didn't come to welcome me. I'm angry, ha ha." He was angry, but he was laughing. Exhilarating smiled helplessly. He was about to say something when he saw Fan Xian's warm smile. He said quietly, "For the sake of reason, you are the Vice Minister of the Office of the Grand Herald, and you are in charge of all diplomatic affairs. Instead of greeting the diplomatic mission, you went to greet the great prince. Are you going to the Bureau of Military Affairs to become a counselor?" These words were spoken calmly, but there was a hint of displeasure in them. Xian Chiwu was slightly surprised. He thought that Fan Xian should not be someone who cared about such things, and he should not be so stupid as to show his displeasure on his face. Fan Xian cupped his hands in salute to the two high-ranking officials of the court. He straightened his back and said, "The diplomatic mission will enter the capital today. Please make the arrangements. If the Ministry of Rights cannot find anyone, you can go and find them." There was a buzzing sound. The two vice ministers suddenly felt their heads swell. They had never imagined that Fan Xian would be so bold as to fight with the great prince. But the palace seemed to have forgotten about this matter. There was no decree. If the diplomatic mission wanted to enter the capital first, it was not a big problem. The problem was, the great prince was there. Ren Shaoan coughed and looked at Fan Xian. He wanted to remind him that Xian Chiwu was a follower of the crown prince, and that he should not show such disrespect to the great prince in front of him. But Fan Xian accepted all of his flirtatious glances. He still smiled and said, "The diplomatic mission will enter the capital first. This is the wish of the princess. You go and make the arrangements. As for the great prince, let them wait." Having said this, he flicked his sleeves and left the relay station, instructing his subordinates to begin preparations for their entry into the capital. He left the two stupefied vice ministers behind him, wondering just what kind of person he was. He dared to fight with the great prince. The expression on Xian Chiwu's face kept changing. In the end, he gritted his teeth and said, "The palace has not said anything. I don't care." Ren Shaoan asked curiously, "If you don't care, where are you going? You are a vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald. If you do not care about the diplomatic mission's entry into the capital, be careful that people do not accuse you." Xian Chiwu smiled and said, "I don't care about the great prince. This is my duty. Even if the great prince is not happy, I have an explanation. I will go with the diplomatic mission. But you, Taichung Temple is in charge of the royal family. On one side is the emperor's son, and on the other side is the emperor's future daughter-in-law. Which side are you going to care about?" Ren Shaoan cursed him countless times in his heart, but he had a close relationship with Fan Xian. He could only shake his head and hurry to the great prince's side. He wanted the Ministry of Rights to make preparations, and at the same time, he wanted to talk to the great prince. He didn't know what would happen on the only official road outside the city gate. After boarding the carriage, Fan Xian looked at Yan Bingyun and shook his head. "Don't show your face. Once we enter the capital, Sir Yan will send someone to pick you up. Remember, before you report, don't let anyone know about you." Yan Bingyun nodded slightly and suddenly said, "Why fight? He is the great prince, the emperor's son. What right do you have to fight with him? You are not a stupid person. Why would you do something so stupid?" The prince. Fan Xian sat beside him and waited for the carriages to depart. He smiled and said, "Is this thing very rare? Besides, it is not me who wants to fight with him. It is some noble who wants to fight with him." Yan Bingyun did not understand. Fan Xian laughed and said, "The young couple has not even met, and they are already fighting for the right to speak in the family. The princess has always had a calm personality, but when she heard that the great prince was going to enter the city first, she frowned and stood on the east side of the river with her mouth wide open. This woman really does not understand. East side of the river? What river? Yan Bingyun rebuked him. You were the one who picked this matter. I don't understand. You haven't even returned to the capital, and you are already shedding all pretense of cordiality with the great prince. What are you thinking? Very good. It seems that you are beginning to consider problems for me, your superior. Fan Xian's face was bitter. I really did not pick the princess. Who would have thought that this quiet princess would also believe in the principle of the east wind suppressing the west wind? This came from chapter 82 of The Stone. It had not yet been written, and Fan Xian was only referring to it. He felt happy. He really was in a hurry to get home. It was that simple. As for why I offended the great prince, the reason is very simple. It is very difficult for me to find another opportunity like today, an opportunity to show how much I dislike the great prince. Why do you want to do this? Although you have been in the north for a long time, I believe that you have learned a lot about me from the diplomatic mission. Fan Xian looked at Yan Bingyun. Yan Bingyun nodded. How is my relationship with the Eastern Palace? On the surface there seems to be some conflict, but in reality, the Crown Prince thinks very highly of you. He was the one who took care of you during the spring examination. Later on, when you went on the diplomatic mission, he also took great care of you and was very friendly. Correct. That is why I am very protective of the Eastern Palace. He was talking about the spring exam cheating scandal. Fan Xian did not explain it clearly to Yan Bingyun. He continued, furthermore, I am on good terms with Crown Prince Jing, and Crown Prince Jing was sent by the second prince, so my relationship with the second prince is not bad. Yan Bingyun immediately understood why Fan Xian offended the great prince. My relationship with the Eastern Palace and the second prince is not bad. If my relationship with the great prince is also good in the future. A self-mocking smile appeared on Fan Xian's face. Let me ask a young man who has the Overwatch Council and the palace treasury in his hands, and is on good terms with 3 princes at the same time. What is this young man trying to do? Do you think those concubines in the palace will like me? Today, the outside of the capital was a mess. The palace, the only place that had the power to calm the turmoil, had not yet issued an edict. As a result, the officials were sweating profusely and cowering in front of the city gate. They looked at the 2 rows of carriages coming from afar, and they could not stop cursing in their hearts. They cursed Fan Xian's mother. The great prince's mother was the emperor's woman, and they did not dare to curse her. The great prince's bodyguards were all valiant soldiers from the western battlefield. Seeing that this stupid diplomatic mission dared to fight with the great prince, they had long since become enraged. But the great prince's military discipline was extremely strict, so they had to endure it. They watched as the seemingly endless carriages of the diplomatic mission slowly passed by them. Among the horsemen, one of the great prince's barbarian generals could not bear it any longer. He yelled, Where did this official come from? Do you not know the rules? Do you want to die? Both sides of the carriages stopped at the same time. The atmosphere was extremely tense. Fan Xian disembarked from the carriage and pretended to straighten his clothes. He faced the faintly visible carriage of the great prince from afar and bowed. Your humble servant, Fan Xian, pays his respects to the great prince. Fan Xian? You are Fan Xian? A powerful voice came from the other side, with a hint of disdain in it. I didn't think that Chen Er's husband would be you. You dare to compete with a prince, you have guts, but aren't you a little too stupid? Fan Xian smiled and spoke very respectfully. I do not dare to fight with your highness, but, before he finished speaking, the calm and confident voice of the great princess of northern Qi came from the unusually luxurious carriage behind him. I am a weak woman, and I have come all the way to the south. Does your highness insist on me staying outside the city for a few more days? The great prince's bodyguards were stunned. It seemed that they had just remembered that there was a noble person in the diplomatic mission. This woman would soon become the great princess, the mistress of these people. Fan Xian glanced at the great prince's horsemen. This was a family matter, and he would not interfere. Chapter 257. The great prince had been fighting outside for many years. Although the western barbarians were no longer as fierce and barbaric as they had been in the past, the battlefield was, after all, filled with wind and snow. Knives were stained with blood. After a few years, this prince was very different from his brothers in the capital. He had fewer empty words and more ruthless military temperament. On this return to the capital, as the great prince was the leader, He could bring 200 to 500 personal guards with him. But in the end, he only chose 200 of them. Presumably, he did not want the officials in the capital and the palace to worry too much. But these personal guards were all valiant people. At this time, they were fighting with the diplomatic mission and could not suppress their murderous aura. These 200 personal guards rode on horses with arrogant and disdainful expressions. People who came from the battlefields would always find these civil officials displeasing to the eye. But these hundreds of eyes looked toward the carriage. They knew the identity of the person in the carriage, and did not dare to say anything. The person in the carriage was the future imperial concubine. No matter how straightforward these vicious people from the Western Army were, they would not be stupid enough to offend their future mistress for the sake of fighting for passage. The director of the Board of Rights came out 10 li from outside the city. At this time, of all the officials present, he was the most senior and had the highest rank. In the midst of the awkward silence, he uncomfortably stood up and prepared to smooth things over. He said a few words, but in the midst of the neighing of the horses, not many people heard him clearly. A series of neighs suddenly rang out. The cavalry of the Western Army's personal camp parted like flowing water. The dozens of steeds were controlled with extreme precision, creating a large space on the not-so-wide official road. Amidst the clattering of hooves, a general clad in profound armor came forward on horseback. Fan Xian was standing beside the great princess carriage. His brows furrowed slightly, and he was about to move out of the way. Unexpectedly, the horses of the great prince's bodyguards took advantage of the opening of the path and charged straight over. These soldiers had been outside for many years and did not know what kind of person Fan Xian was. Earlier, they had seen this handsome young man speak, and they were already full of anger. Now, they wanted to frighten him to the ground and humiliate him. Thus, the large horses in front of them brushed past Fan Xian's body. It looked extremely dangerous. Fan Xian wore a smile on his face. He bowed slightly to the general on the horse, completely ignoring the jumping, neighing, and provoking steeds beside him. "Your subject Fan Xian greets your highness." The one galloping over was the great prince of Qin Kingdom. His eyes were bright and spirited, and there was a natural murderous intent in them. His brows were straight, his nose was straight, and his cheekbones were slightly high, but they did not appear ugly. On the contrary, there was a hint of valiance about him. The great prince sat on his horse, his entire body reflecting light in his armor. He looked like a god, and no one dared to look directly at him. Thus, Fan Xian did not look directly at her. He only smiled shyly and slightly lowered his head in greeting. It seemed that the great prince had not thought that the civil official in front of him, who appeared somewhat reserved and lowly, was the most popular person in the capital, Fan Xian. He couldn't help being slightly startled and suddenly said, "This June? Why is he smiling like a woman?" The great prince's temperament was straightforward, and he was just not in the mood to speak. However, his personal guards at his side heard it and thought that their master was purposely humiliating this civil official who dared to compete with them for the road. So they all began to laugh. Their laughter rose to the sky on the outskirts of Jingdo. There was an indescribable feeling of disdain. The great prince was slightly startled, but he was too lazy to care. A trace of a smile rose to the corners of his lips. And those proud horses were getting closer and closer to Fan Xian. He could already hear the sound of the steeds' nostrils flaring. A few long horse faces closed in on him. It was the great prince's personal guards who wanted to use their horses to force the diplomatic group off the road. Fan Xian frowned slightly. He had not expected that the great prince would not give face to his future wife, and it seemed that he would not give face to his distant brother-in-law. Seeing the horse faces getting closer and closer, the excitement in the eyes of the huge horses gradually grew. He knew that these war horses were not easy to control and were bloodthirsty. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart and prepare to temporarily retreat. In any case, he had already achieved his goal of making enemies with the great prince. There was no need to truly turn against him. Fan Xian had never had much to do with the military, and this was one of his biggest weaknesses. If the old generals of the Bureau of Military Affairs thought that he was purposely trying to make the Western Army lose face, he was afraid that in the future, he would not have an easy time in court. That was what he thought, but he forgot that his subordinates did not think the same way. Seeing that the commissioner was in danger, the Overwatch Council officials and swordsmen hidden in the diplomatic group all revealed themselves. Like a dozen wisps of smoke, they wandered out, either standing on the carriages or finding high ground on the side of the road. They all raised the crossbows in their hands and aimed them at the approaching horses. This cannot be done. The director of the Board of Rights was shocked. Using force outside the capital? If news of this were to spread, how could the court maintain its reputation? Naturally, he would no longer be the director of the Board of Rights. Would the great prince have any good to do? Even if Fan Xian had the backing of the Overwatch Council, would the emperor not reward him with a paddle? Only now did the welcoming officials react. Seeing the cold faces of the Overwatch Council officials, they remembered Fan Xian's frightening identity. One by one they shouted, "All of you, stop! What nonsense!" The great prince looked at this scene coldly. For some reason, he found this Overwatch Council dog called Fan Xian to be much more pleasing to the eye. In his heart, anyone who dared to face him directly was someone with gut. At this moment, Fan Xian was secretly complaining. These Overwatch Council officials had been trained well by him along the way. He did not think that at this moment they would be worried about his safety and not care about the face of the court. They dared to aim their crossbows at the Western Army heading east. It must be known that these soldiers had fought for the country for a long time. If news of this got out, even the old cripple Chun would be upset for a while. The great prince laughed. It seemed that he could see the worry in Fan Xian's heart and was ready to see how he would deal with this matter. Seeing that someone dared to threaten them, the blood and murderous aura that they had cultivated over the years suddenly surged. They roared in unison, raised their spears and drew their bows, and surrounded the front of the diplomatic group. At the same time, the horses had already surrounded Fan Xian. Fan Xian raised his hand and bent his middle and ring fingers. Surrounded by the horses, he made a clear gesture. After the Overwatch Council officials and swordsmen saw this gesture, their faces were expressionless. They put away their crossbows, dismounted from their horses, and returned to their ranks. They did this in unison, without the slightest hesitation. The great prince rode on his horse. His expression did not change in the exposed half of his face, but in the depths of his heart, he was somewhat shocked. This seemingly weak official in front of him was actually so strict with his subordinate. In such a situation, with one gesture, he could have everyone immediately stop. This kind of discipline was something that even his Western army probably could not achieve. The great prince knew that in the outskirts of Jingdo, nothing could actually happen. Furthermore, the crown prince and the second prince were waiting at the city gate. So, he gently lifted the reins of his horse and waved his hand to signal for the soldiers to retreat. A wave of disorderly clattering rang out. The soldiers unwillingly put away their bows and pulled their horses back. Compared to the imposing manner of the Overwatch Council, it was quite a bit lacking. The great prince couldn't help but furrow his brows. At this moment, the horses surrounding Fan Xian were also preparing to pull back. Unexpectedly, they were too close. In addition, the yellow soil on the road was gradually drying. Dust rose up and poured into the nose of a large horse. The horse kicked its hooves and twisted its long neck. Immediately, it made the horses panic at the same time. Two horses charged toward Fan Xian at the same time. This was purely an accident. The great prince watched from a distance of 30 feet. He couldn't help but feel shocked. If he actually ran over and killed this favorite of his father's, then all of his efforts in the West would probably be for naught. But He immediately remembered Fan Xian's legendary abilities, and couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. He thought to himself, since you are the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, you can't be run over and killed by a few horses, right? The horses charged forward and immediately buried Fan Xian in the rising dust. Only the aces could faintly see two streaks of light in the dust. With two muffled thuds, the dust gradually settled. Fan Xian still maintained that hateful smile. He stood somewhat cautiously in the center of the field. The two startled horses swept past his body and collapsed to the ground. The rider seemed to have fainted, but the two horses were not so lucky. The heads of the horses had already flown far away with two spurts of blood. The bodies of the horses shook the yellow soil on the road. Behind Fan Xian, two machete men dressed in brown clothes held tightly to long knives. Their faces were cold, and their eyes were cold. They looked at the great prince's personal camp not far away. Two knives came down together and beheaded two horses. What a fast knife and what a fast attack! The great prince's eyes narrowed slightly. Looking at the two machete men behind Fan Xian, he didn't know why, but he felt that their attacks were somewhat familiar. His fingers gently tapped the armor on the outside of his thigh, making a slight clanging sound. Looking at Fan Xian, he said, word by word, "Sir Fan is indeed powerful. I have fought for many years. I did not think that as soon as I returned to the capital, I would have two horses beheaded by you in front of everyone. So, this is how the court welcomes soldiers home." Fan Xian sighed and raised his hand to cover his mouth and nose. It was as if the smell of the horse blood was a bit piercing. He explained, "Your Highness, even if you gave me 1,000 guts, I would not dare to kill your Highness's warhorses." Only now did he realize that although this prince was crude, he was not stupid. Every word was connected to him. Only when he heard the great prince refer to himself as Your Highness, did he remember that when the great prince was ordered to return to the east, the emperor had already made the great prince a king. This was the first of all the descendants of the royal family to be made a king. Thinking of how he had greatly offended him today, Fan Xian couldn't help but furrow his brows. As the great prince's expression gradually grew cold, his personal guard at his side walked forward and said something. Hearing these words, the great prince's gaze focused. Looking at the two machete men behind Fan Xian, he furrowed his brows and said, "So, they are tiger guards." Gao De said in a low voice from behind Fan Xian, "The one beside the great prince is a tiger guard." Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and asked, "You know him?" "I do not, but I know," Gao De replied in a low voice. The horse blood on his long knife was still dripping down. Fan Xian said, "Since you are a tiger guard, how can you be so rude to the great prince?" Gao De said in a low voice, "Young master, the emperor has decreed that I only need to protect you. As for who the other party is, there is no need to consider." The two of them spoke very quietly. A strange expression suddenly appeared between Fan Xian's brows. After a moment of silence, he suddenly bowed to the great prince's horse and did not say anything more. At this time, the great prince's personal guards had long since carried the two unconscious soldiers back. They were only waiting for the prince's order to rush over and give the diplomatic mission a good beating. At this moment, the great prince sank into silence. Suddenly, the great prince rode up to Fan Xian's side. He lowered his body slightly and said in a low voice, "I like your temper, but it is inauspicious for you to kill a horse. After you enter the capital, be careful that I make trouble for you." Fan Xian looked at this man and sighed. "Great Prince, this really has nothing to do with me. Please understand, Your Highness." The great prince snorted coldly. As a member of the royal family, he naturally knew the authority of the Tiger Guards. He thought that it was the bodyguards his father had arranged for the diplomatic mission and that it had nothing to do with Fan Xian. But deep in his heart, he was still extremely angry. "It was my idea. If Your Highness is dissatisfied, please do not make things difficult for Sir Fan." After a long period of silence in the carriage, the princess's voice finally rang out again. At this time, all the officials surrounded them. Ren Xiao held Fan Xian's hand, Xian Chiwu held the great prince's leg, and the eunuchs of the palace tightly gripped the reins of the great prince's horse. The minister of rights blew his beard and stared, scolding the hateful soldiers back. There was also an elder of the Bureau of Military Affairs who acted as a mediator. In short, the kingdom of Qing was mobilized to surround the great prince and Fan Xian, turning hostility into friendship and hostility into peace. With so many officials surrounding them, the conflict between the diplomatic mission and the Western army naturally had to end. Otherwise, if an elder were to be injured, it would be equivalent to not giving face to the royal court. What was the royal court? It was not the 3 ministries, 6 departments, and 4 temples. It was the face of all the officials. At this time, it seemed that something had happened in the distance at the city gate. Finally, there was a reaction. A rider arrived in a cloud of dust. After asking around for a long time, they finally understood that the diplomatic mission had arrived early to fight with the great prince. Such a big matter was not something the subordinates could handle, so they quickly reported it. At this time, both sides were fighting. Even if Fan Xian wanted to retreat, the princess in the carriage and the officials of the diplomatic mission did not want to retreat either. They insisted on entering the city before the great prince. But today, the great prince had lost 2 horses, and had lost a lot of face. If he did not know that the Tiger Guards were his father's trusted aides, and could not be ordered around by an official, he would have given the order to open the way. But at this time, his temper had been roused. How could he let the diplomatic mission enter the city first? What **T princess? In the future, you will be the one to wash my feet with. Unable to come to an agreement, the officials of the royal court grabbed his leg and stopped his horse. Naturally, the fight could not be fought, and so they could only resort to arguing. Although the soldiers of the Western army were skilled in battle, when it came to arguing, they were no match for the diplomatic officials of the diplomatic mission who were skilled in the art of sophistry. From the rules of the royal court to the friendship between the 2 countries, from the emperor's heart to the official's face, the great prince gradually lost the upper hand. He stubbornly blocked the road, refusing to let the diplomatic mission enter. A bright yellow carriage slowly approached the scene of the accident, amidst the noise of the noisiest market in the royal court since the founding of the kingdom of Qing. Finally, someone noticed it and quickly stopped talking. By this time, Fan Xian had already retreated to the side of Yan Bingyun's carriage and was saying something. With Yan Bingyun's reminder, he immediately noticed the carriage and rushed forward to greet it. He tidied his official robes and followed the officials beside him in saluting. "Greetings, Your Highness." The Crown Prince had originally been waiting at the city gates to welcome the great prince back to the capital, according to the Emperor's imperial edict. He had no idea that there would be such a ruckus, and so he had no choice but to come personally to mediate. Seeing that the Crown Prince had arrived, the great prince did not dare to scold him. He quickly dismounted, put on his armor, and walked in front of the Crown Prince's carriage. He was about to kneel. At this point, the Crown Prince had already gotten off the carriage. He hurriedly stopped him from kneeling down. He continued to say, "Big brother, you have armor on you. There is no need to bow. Furthermore, you are my elder brother. How can I allow you to bow to me?" The great prince's temperament was quite straightforward. The Crown Prince said he could not bow, so he did not bow. He straightened up and took off his helmet. Although the officials of Taichung Temple and the Board of Rites were muttering to themselves, this was a matter between the 2 brothers. Since His Majesty did not care about such etiquette, they, as officials, had no right to say anything. The Crown Prince looked at his elder brother's face and spoke with some emotion. "Big brother has been fighting for the country for many years. He has been exposed to the elements and has lost weight. The great prince smiled and replied, "What's wrong with that? Riding horses outside is quite comfortable. You also know that I dislike staying in the manor. It's so boring. If it were not for grandmother insisting that I come back, I would have stayed outside for a few more days." The crown prince scolded, "It is not only grandmother. Father, Empress, Lady Ning, and us brothers all want you to come back earlier." The great prince glanced at Fan Xian and said, "I'm afraid there are some people who don't want me to come back earlier." The crown prince saw that his expression was not happy and asked what had happened. He couldn't help but laugh. This laughter was a bit strange. The officials did not know what the crown prince was playing at. They saw the crown prince gently wave his hand and have Fan Xian come over. He asked, "Did you fight with the great prince? Do you know that this is a serious crime?" Fan Xian smiled and explained, "I didn't have the courage. It really was the great princess of Northern Qi who had traveled a long way and caught a cold on the way. She could not bear to wait outside the city." The crown prince nodded slightly and took his brother's hand to walk to the side of the carriage. Quietly giving his greetings, he then turned and smiled at his brother. "Don't bother with these officials. Besides, you haven't been in the capital these 2 years, so you don't know what happened. Presumably, you don't know Fan Xian. Come, let me introduce you." Fan Xian and the crown prince had not actually met each other much, but seeing the crown prince's warm expression, he knew that the crown prince wanted to show his close relationship with him in front of the officials. So he walked forward with a smile and bowed to the great prince. "I am Fan Xian of the Imperial College. Greetings, great prince." "You are a 4th-rank official." The crown prince scolded him. "How could you have forgotten your position?" Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. "On this journey north and south, I was a bit muddle-headed. Please forgive me, Crown Prince." The Crown Prince quietly said to the great prince, "Fan Xian is now helping the director." "I know that. The commissioner of the Overwatch Council. What a powerful official," the great prince said with a cold smile. The crown prince smiled and tried to smooth things over. "Never mind. Even if it wasn't for my sake, for Chen-Er's sake, you can't get angry with him. Speaking of which, when you were young, you and Chen-Er were very close. In the end, Fan Xian is also our brother-in-law. We are all family. What are you angry about?" The great prince snorted coldly and looked at Fan Xian, who was somewhat reserved. "This is exactly what I am angry about. In the palace, Chen-Er is the apple of everyone's eye, and yet she is married to such a sissy. Just looking at it makes me angry. They haven't even been married for half a year, yet he asked to go on a diplomatic mission and left his new wife in the manor. With such a passion for power and wealth, how could he be a good match for Chen-Er?" Fan Xian could not help but laugh bitterly. Only now did he realize that he had completely gone in the wrong direction. It turned out that fighting for the right of way was indeed a family matter, but it was not a family matter between the great prince and his future wife. It was a family matter between the great prince and his brother-in-law. Chapter 258. In the end, Fan Xian just smiled without a trace of arrogance. He was extremely sincere, playing his part as a brother-in-law, and putting in the capital of an official. He let the surrounding officials see, who would have thought that this matter of fighting for passage and offending people had come from his brain. Fan Xian was born with a set of advantages. As the saying goes, one cannot be a bad person. It could also be considered the path of a treacherous thief. He was very willing to offend and bully people behind their backs, but on the surface, he was very willing to give in. This was the way to truly reap benefit. For example, the eldest princess had been tricked by him several times, and forced out of the palace by letters. But to this day, she still did not know that the mastermind behind the scenes was her son-in-law. She thought that this son-in-law would only suffer in silence, and would still listen to her in the north, not daring to turn against her. He had always believed in one thing. It was good to be flamboyant and arrogant, but he had to be low-key flamboyant and eat pork in silence. It was said that those who could be moved must be moved, and those who could not be moved at the moment, he would not move even if you beat him to death. Naturally, the great prince was someone he could not touch at the moment, but today, he just had to fight with the great prince. This was already a great rebellion. Naturally, no one knew that he was doing this purely for the emperor in the palace to see. The great prince, who had a straightforward personality, was, without a doubt, the best acting target. Perhaps only Chen Pingping, that old fox, could guess a little of this. In the end, under the mediation of the crown prince, the two sides came to a compromise. The vanguard of the diplomatic mission and the great prince's personal army entered the capital together. But this was not in accordance with the rules, and made the director of the Board of Rites angry. It made the face of Taichung Temple full of fear. How to arrange the guards of honor became a big problem. The crown prince looked at Fan Xian and did not say anything, but he did not know where he came from. He pretended to scold him. "You are also making trouble." It was clearly agreed that the diplomatic mission would arrive in the capital the day after tomorrow. "Why did you suddenly arrive early? You left the court with no arrangements and caused all this to happen." Fan Xian smiled. "I am also in a hurry to go home. Your Highness, please forgive me this time. Who knows if there will be an imperial censor who will accuse me tomorrow." In fact, he also felt strange in his heart. After not seeing him for a few months, the Eastern Palace Master's complexion was much better than before. The slight timidity and gloom were no longer there, and his face was glowing. He did not know what good news he had received. Of course, he did not know that after the eldest princess left the royal palace and returned to Xinyang, one of the two mountains that had always been pressing down on the crown prince had suddenly disappeared. His mood immediately brightened, and in addition to the emperor's many comforting edicts, the crown prince's days were much better than before. In the hearts of the officials, they always thought that the crown prince had it easy, and the second prince must not be too comfortable. But at the city gate, when the crowd looked at the second prince, who was in the tent preparing to welcome the great prince back to the capital, they did not see a trace of unease on the face of this elegant nobleman. Instead, it was the young fellow by his side that attracted even more attention. This was the emperor's youngest son. The emperor had given birth to a total of 4 sons. The crown prince was not one of them, so this was the third prince, who had been raised deep in the palace. This year, he was only 9 years old. This time, when the great prince returned to the capital, the emperor had ordered all the princes in the capital to come out and welcome him. This was a show of respect. At the same time, this young prince, who had never appeared in front of the court officials, had his first opportunity to make an official appearance. The second prince held the young prince's hand and bowed to the great prince. The great prince seemed to have a good relationship with the second prince. He stepped forward and gave him a bear hug, then rubbed the little fellow's head. In a rough voice he said, "How did you grow so tall?" The little fellow giggled, and his face revealed an innocent expression. He replied, "In the future, when I grow as tall as you, I will go out and fight the Hu people." This young prince's birth mother was a sister of the Fan Manor's Lady Lu, so in a roundabout way, he was somewhat related to Fan Xian. But when Fan Xian looked at this young and beautiful young prince and saw the innocent smile on his face, his heart skipped a beat. He saw a trace of self-control in his innocent smile that did not match his age. Involuntarily, a slight smile rose to the corner of his mouth. He thought to himself, "I have been pretending to be innocent and bashful since I was young. How dare you play this trick in front of me? Fan Xian really is selling a smile without knowing it." Naturally, the second prince also knew what had happened earlier. He smiled bitterly at Fan Xian. "I say, brother-in-law, I think all the officials in the capital should thank the heavens and earth if you can make less trouble one day." Fan Xian's smile seemed even more bitter than a gold thread. He explained, It is really the Princess of Northern Cheese will. I am just a mere official in Anjou. How could I be so daring? The Crown Prince frowned imperceptibly, as if displeased with the second prince's tone of voice when he spoke to Fan Xian. He said lightly, "Second brother, the ceremony is not finished. Let us address each other by official rank." This was a bit unreasonable. Earlier, the Crown Prince of the Eastern Palace had called Fan Xian brother-in-law quite affectionately, but now he refused to let the second prince call him that. The second prince's expression was as usual. He chuckled and made a sound of acknowledgement. He moved closer to Fan Xian and lowered his voice. "Before the spring examination, I told you to go back to the manor and ask Chun'er what she called me. Did you ask her?" Only now did Fan Xian remember that matter. He shook his head and smiled. "Your Highness also knows that something happened during the spring examination. I forgot for a moment. Today, when I return to the manor, I will ask her." The second prince smiled and said nothing more. He took the third prince's hand and followed the Crown Prince and the Great Prince in front of them toward the city gate. Although the two of them spoke in low voices, it still reached the Great Prince's ears. This prince, who had spent many years on campaigns outside, could not help but have many doubts in his heart. Although he knew of Fan Xian's reputation, he was not in the capital, so he did not know what kind of power Fan Xian held in his hands. At this moment, he was shocked to find that whether it was the second prince or the Crown Prince, their words were very gentle toward Fan Xian. It was as if they were afraid that the officials present did not know that they had a very close relationship with Fan Xian. A mere official was valued so highly by the two sons of the imperial family that they were willing to lower their status. The Great Prince could not help but furrow his brows and feel a bit unhappy. Fan Xian, on the other hand, had other thoughts. He looked at the four princes in front of him, dressed in bright yellow and plain yellow, walking toward the pitch-black city gate. For a moment, he was somewhat absent-minded. He wondered if there would come a day when he would stand among these four brothers. Autumn in the capital was indescribably beautiful. The sky was high and the clouds were light. The yellowing leaves drooped by the side of the houses, unwilling to be rushed into the water. The flowing water by the side of the street was inevitably a bit lonely. At the end of the long street, a corner of the distant eaves of the palace occasionally peeked out, hanging in the blue sky, displaying its majesty. The Great Prince's entourage had long since left with a lingering anger, but the envoys' carriages deliberately slowed down. Accompanied by a group of officials from the Chamberlain of Dependencies and Taichung Temple, they slowly made their way to the palace. Since they had already entered the capital, Fan Xian was no longer in a hurry. In any case, he could not go home immediately. He had to go to the palace gate to reply to the edict, so he finally had some spare time to look around. Although he had only been in the capital for a year and was far less familiar with it than he was with Danzhou, for some reason, as soon as he entered, he saw the houses all around him, and smelled the unique smells of the capital. Fan Xian felt refreshed. "Sir, you are in a hurry to return to the capital. There must be something at home." The voice of the Princess of Northern Qi floated out from the carriage next to the steed. Fan Xian smiled, but did not reply. He knew that she was deliberately trying to befriend this seemingly ordinary, but actually important official. But along the way, the two of them had communicated enough. Now that he was in the capital, he had many eyes and ears around him. It was best to avoid this last encounter. Furthermore, the princess had guessed what he was thinking, but he did not know how to respond. The Fan family was now very popular in the capital, and the entire household was safe. No one knew why he was in such a hurry. He urged the horse forward, coming to the side of Yan Bingyun's carriage. In a low voice, he said, "You must take her with you, if you don't want to cause me trouble." Inside the carriage, Yan Bingyun shook his head. He looked at Lady Shun, who he had tied up securely, but who still stared fiercely at him with those familiar eyes. He did not understand when Sir Fan had developed the hobby of being a matchmaker. He sighed and changed the subject. Sir, today's struggle over the road was not a wise decision. The Overwatch Council has always been neutral in the struggle between the princes. Sir once said, and what I heard has been confirmed, that the Crown Prince and the Second Prince both have expectations of you. Since this is the case, for the sake of fairness, you should not provoke the Great Prince. This is unavoidably contrary to the purpose of the Council. Fan Xian was silent. He knew that what Yan Bingyan said made sense. As an official of the Kingdom of Qing, especially the Commissioner of the Overwatch Council, he would either never have any dealings with the princes, or if he did, he would have to be impartial. Otherwise, the palace would be convinced that the Overwatch Council would not favor any of the princes. But Fan Xian could not do that, because he knew that his identity was not as simple as that of an official. If he was biased towards the princes, it would at most make His Majesty suspect that he was planning for power and riches in the future. He would never be as loyal as Chen Pingping. But if he were to be impartial, he feared that His Majesty would suspect that he was not willing to be an official. This was Fan Xian's greatest fear. The carriages arrived at Qingdao Square. There was no longer a need for the bailiffs of the capital government to maintain order, because they had arrived at a relatively quiet place where the officials lived. Naturally, there were not as many commoners standing on the side of the street watching the commotion. At this moment, one of the carriages broke away from the main group and quietly drove into an alley on the side of the street. Someone could faintly be seen inside to receive it. Although it was quiet, in reality, there were naturally court officials who saw it clearly. They knew that the composition of the diplomatic mission was complicated, and that it was probably the work of the Overwatch Council. Looking at Fan Xian's serious expression, no one dared to ask too much. Fan Xian's expression was naturally serious, because they were about to reach the royal palace, and the vermilion palace walls were right in front of them. A group of members of the diplomatic mission waited outside the palace gates. The imperial power was majestic, and naturally no one dared to relax their appearance. It was just that they had traveled thousands of miles, and inevitably it was tiring. After waiting for a long time, there was still no edict. The officials all felt a little uneasy, but they thought about how this diplomatic mission to northern Qi had carved out a lot of territory for the royal court. Furthermore, Fan Xian had made a great show of face in the northern Qi royal court. That carriage of old books did not seem to be worth much, but they thought that His Majesty should be proud of it. How could he leave them out in the cold? The officials of the Board of Rights who accompanied them outside the palace gates gradually became uncomfortable. Ren Shaoan moved closer to Fan Xian and said quietly, "At this time, His Majesty should be meeting with the Great Prince. As officials, we naturally have to wait a little longer." Fan Xian smiled and said nothing. The carriage of the northern Qi princess had already been led in by the eunuchs of the palace, and the important matters were more or less settled. Fan Xian could guess why the diplomatic mission had been left out in the cold outside the royal palace. The imperial soldiers of the royal palace looked coldly at the anxious and frightened officials outside the palace gates, without a trace of emotion on their faces. And the eunuchs guarding the palace gates naturally did not look directly at them. But Fan Xian's status was different from the others. He was a princess of the palace, and most importantly, she was a highly favored figure. Furthermore, she was a high-ranking official of the Overwatch Council. On this diplomatic mission, it was assumed that he would be rewarded in the coming days, so the eunuchs had already brought over a round stool and invited him to rest. Fan Xian was surprised. "Is this in accordance with the rules?" As he spoke, a head eunuch came over with a fawning expression and helped him sit on the stool. "I say, young Master Fan, I know that His Majesty has always favored you. Besides, you have traveled thousands of miles, so it is only right that you sit on a stool." "Oh, why is Eunuch Ho here?" Fan Xian pretended to be surprised. The eunuch in front of him was the one he had met the first time he had followed Lady Lu and Roro into the palace. He knew that the eunuch had a good relationship with Fan Manor, so his face showed affection. And the eunuch had deliberately called him young Master Fan, naturally to put on a show of affection. Fan Xian continued with a smile. I have just returned from the outside, and I am truly poor. Today there is no reward. Eunuch Ho gave a shrill laugh and lowered his voice. Who doesn't know that young Master Fan is a master who can turn stone into gold? Furthermore, in the future, you will hold a mountain of gold. The old servant was about to say a few more flattering words when he heard the palace gates creak open. A eunuch ran out to deliver the emperor's verbal edict. Fan Xian quickly removed the stool and knelt in front of the palace gates along with the other officials. As he had expected, the emperor gave Fan Xian a good scolding. It was nothing more than relying on his talent, looking down on others, being extremely audacious, and so on. He also said that he was tired today, and told him to report back to the palace the next day. He ordered Count Sinan to discipline him well and punish him severely. At the end of the edict, however, the diplomatic mission was greatly rewarded, and that they would be rewarded in the future. The officials looked at each other. They had not expected that the diplomatic mission would receive such treatment on its first day back in the capital. They could not help but sigh. But some of the more cunning officials looked at Fan Xian with trepidation. His Majesty's verbal scolding had been fierce, but in the end, he had done nothing. He had only ordered Count Sinan to discipline him. It seemed that Sir Fan was indeed favored by the emperor. Fan Xian kowtowed to accept the edict. His expression was somewhat awkward, but his heart was slightly happy. He stood up and patted his bottom. When he turned around, he saw an old acquaintance. It was Gong Dian, the current commander of the palace guards. When Gong Dian saw Fan Xian, a look of admiration appeared on his face. He was about to come up and chat with Fan Xian, but to his surprise, Fan Xian cupped his hands in salute and apologized. He leapt onto his horse, clamped his legs together, and with a wave of his whip, he galloped off into the wide square in front of the palace, leaving behind only a cloud of dust. Gong Dian was stunned. He and his subordinates stared blankly at the light smoke in the distance. Although there was no explicit order against riding horses in front of the palace, Fan Xian was probably the first official to be able to run so nimbly. Fan Xian had already taken care of matters in the council. As for Gouda and the other 7 tiger guards, they would be taken over by the relevant people. He galloped his horse along the long street, riding against the wind. He didn't know how long he had been running, but he finally entered the south of the city. The sound of hooves rang out on the long street where the stone lion occasionally appeared in front of Fan Manor. It was already night, and the manors of the nobles and ministers on the long street had already been hung up with lanterns. There were only a few pairs, and they were not very eye-catching. Only the front door of Fan Manor was brightly lit. The front door was wide open, and a group of attendants, guards, and guests were standing outside in anticipation. Inside, Lady Lu had also lowered herself to instruct the servant girls and senior servants to heat up tea again and again, waiting for Fan Xian to return. News of the diplomatic mission's arrival in the outskirts of the capital had long spread into the city. They had originally thought that it would take at least 2 days to arrange the formalities before they could enter the capital, but the young mistress in the manor next door coldly said, "He will arrive today." Everyone knew that the present Lady Fan, Lady Lin, was no ordinary person. Since she said that Fan Xian would arrive today, then he would. That was why everyone had waited so long. As for the news of the fight with the great prince, no one in the manor knew. Otherwise, they would have been very worried. "He's coming, he's coming." The sharp-eyed servants had long since seen the horses galloping in the distance. They all rushed down the stone steps and formed 2 groups. Amidst the rustling sounds, Fan Xian rode his horse over and flipped off. He gently kicked Ting Zijing's butt, who was preparing to use it as a horse stool. He laughed and scolded him. "Your broken leg, don't learn from those manor people." "Welcome back, young master," the two groups of servants called out in unison. Fan Xian smiled and said nothing. He took 2 steps up the stone steps, took a hot towel from a servant girl, and wiped his face carelessly. Then he took a cup of warm tea and rinsed his mouth. He knew that this was a necessary procedure, and there was nothing to be particular about. But when he returned to the manor and saw the familiar servants and servant girls, he was in a good mood. Even the smile of Lady Lu, who was behind the door, seemed less calculating and more sincere. "Your father is in the study." Lady Lu took the towel from his hand and quietly reminded him. Fan Xian nodded. Suddenly, he furrowed his brows and shook his head. "Auntie." He swallowed the last word, auntie, and smiled. "I'll go see my sister and Juana first. I'll go see father immediately." Lady Lu knew that the young master in front of her could not be constrained by filial piety, and could only nod helplessly. As soon as Fan Xian entered the manor, he saw a dark-skinned fat man rushing toward him. He couldn't help but turn pale with fright. It had only been a few months since he had last seen this prodigy in the accounting department. But he had no time to ask and immediately shouted, "I'll report the bill later. I have something to do." Fan Xian paused and scolded, "I'm in a good mood today. If you don't pay attention to me, I won't bother to talk to you about accounts that you don't understand." Fan Xian was also surprised, but he laughed. For some reason, he thought of the row of 4 princes outside the city gate. He took something out of his robes and handed it to Fan Xian. He laughed and scolded, "What account talk? I think it's a nonsense talk. You go and play by yourself first. We're brothers, so don't play this reunion after a long separation." Fan Xian muttered to himself, "I don't want to play this game of brotherhood with you." Thinking this, he watched as Fan Xian entered the back of the manor. He felt very uncomfortable. After Fan Xian got married, he had his own manor in the back of Fan Manor. However, the 2 residences were connected, so it was only 1 manor and 2 residences. He and his sister were very close, and Juana and Ruoro were very close, so Ruoro spent most of her time in this courtyard. And now that he had returned, it was natural that his father would stay in the study. But what was strange was that Juana and his sister did not come out to greet him. This made Fan Xian quicken his step. The serving girl next to him could not keep up, and panted as she replied, "The lady is still here, and so is the mistress." Fan Xian frowned, thinking that this was a very inauspicious thing to say. He didn't know who had trained this serving girl. He came to the door of his bedroom and gently pushed it open, but found that it was locked from the inside. Fan Xian was startled, and didn't know what to say. He called out a few times, but no one answered. He was puzzled, and so he knocked harder on the door. If it weren't for the respect he had for his wife, he would have broken in already. After a while, he heard Cece's uneasy voice from inside. "Young master, the mistress is asleep. Please don't knock." Fan Xian's frown deepened. He didn't know what had happened. He had come all the way back, and Juana had closed the door and refused to see him. He looked at the dim light inside the door and said nothing. With a wave of his sleeve, he went to the other room. This time, he didn't knock, but pushed the door open and entered. The girl in the room was startled, and she stood up. After seeing that it was Fan Xian, the indifference and wariness between her brows gradually melted, and her eyes flashed with unfeigned joy. She crouched down and said, "Brother, you're back." Fan Xian looked at Ruoro, and his previous unhappiness disappeared. He smiled warmly. "What? Are you not happy to see me back?" Fan Ruoro smiled and walked forward. She pulled on his sleeve and led him to sit down. "It's not like we haven't seen each other for a long time. Do you want me to make a big fuss before you're satisfied?" Fan Xian shook his head helplessly. "You always have such an indifferent personality. You won't change it even in front of me. Fan Ruoro smiled. If I change it, will I still be Ruoro? As she spoke, she poured a cup of tea and carefully brought it to her brother's lips. Fan Xian accepted it, but didn't drink it immediately. Instead, he stared at his sister's face, which wasn't very pretty, but was extremely refreshing. For a moment, the room fell into a strange silence. The two siblings were both very patient people, and they waited for the other to speak first. In the end, it was Fan Xian who felt sorry for his sister. He sighed. Why do you have to do this? If there's anything, wait for me to come back and deal with it. A trace of sadness flashed across Fan Ruoro's face. She knew that her brother had seen through her plans. I was waiting for you to come back and see you, she said softly. That's why it's been delayed until today. Fan Xian stood up and walked directly under her bed. He pulled out a package and took out an unremarkable box from the drawer behind the bed. He flipped the box over on the table. A few banknotes, a few beaded hairpins, and a few pieces of silver fell onto the table with a clatter. He furrowed his brows as he looked at the items on the table. Running away from home with just these few things, it's far from enough. Fan Ruoro was silent for a moment. She took out a self-defense dagger from her sleeve. Fan Xian was angry, happy, and distressed. He looked at his sister and said, You are a noble young lady. You don't know the dangers of the world. Even if you don't want to marry, don't you think about how worried father will be by running away from home? And what about me? Why don't you think about how I feel? Fan Ruoro lowered her head. Her hands tightly gripped the corners of her sleeves. After a moment of silence, she said, When did father ever really care about me? As for you, have you forgotten? You taught me to control my own destiny, especially when it comes to marriage. I can't let my family arrange it. Fan Xian was speechless. In this world, no young lady from a noble family would have such a rebellious idea, let alone put it into practice. His sister was brave and even reckless enough to run away because of the stories he had told her when she was young. He had taught her how to be a good person in his letters. Could it be that cousin Mei had told her so much that new Juexin was ready to awaken? He slapped the table uneasily. He really didn't know what his actions back then would bring to his sister. After all, this world was completely different from that world. Different thoughts could be a dagger that could hurt oneself. He suddenly raised his head and said gently, But an arranged marriage is not necessarily a bad thing. You have never been with Hongqing. How do you know if your marriage will be a happy one? Fan Ruoro's head was still lowered, but her voice did not soften. You have known the Crown Prince since you were young. You know that I don't like him. If anyone else had heard this, they would have been scared half to death. How could the young lady of Fan Manor say something like whether she liked him or not? Fan Xian's mind was a mess, but he still tried to explain. Not necessarily. Look at me and your sister-in-law. We were also arranged to be married, and now we live happily. Fan Ruoro suddenly raised her head. With a hint of determination and stubbornness, she said, Brother, not everyone is as lucky as you and your sister-in-law. Fan Xian was stunned. This was the first time he had seen disapproval on his sister's face. Ever since they were young, Ruoro had always looked at him with admiration mixed with admiration. This was the first time he had heard Ruoro directly disagree with his opinion. He couldn't help but be shocked at the changes that had occurred to his sister. After a long silence, the expression on Fan Xian's face gradually softened. In the end, he laughed heartily. There was not a trace of falsehood in the joy in his laughter. He was indeed very pleased that the silly little girl had finally grown up and learned to stick to her own views. Ruoro, do you trust me? Fan Xian looked at his sister with a smile and an expression of encouragement. After hesitating for a moment, Fan Ruoro also showed her usual tranquil smile and nodded heavily. Fan Xian looked at the things on the table. He gently shook his head and smiled. If you trust me, then don't play around with these things. I will take care of it. Ever since she learned that the palace had appointed her to be married, Fan Ruoro had sunk into silence. She knew how rebellious her thoughts were, and what kind of disaster it would bring if she went against the edict. But since she was young, she had been taught by her brother's letters. Deep in her heart, the seemingly weak but actually strong seed of freedom had long been planted. But no one had said these thoughts to her. Deep in her heart, she was afraid that even her most trusted brother would oppose her decision. Hearing Fan Xian's promise, Ruoro's uneasiness for the past month suddenly disappeared like a gentle autumn breeze. Her tense nerves, which had been tense for a month, suddenly relaxed. Yes, her brother was back. Naturally, he would make the decision for her. The brother and sister had been separated for many months. Naturally, they had things to talk about. But Fan Ruoro saw that his expression seemed a little strange. Only then did she remember that if her brother wasn't talking to her father in the study, then he should be with her sister-in-law. Why would he come to her room? She thought of something and couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. Brother, when you were persuading me earlier, didn't you say that although you and sister-in-law were appointed to be married, you were happy? Why are you so worried now? Fan Xian's heart jumped. His sister and Warner had a good relationship. Naturally, she would know why Warner had shut herself in the room. He quickly asked, "What happened?" Fan Ruoro gave a rare mischievous smile. "I can't help you with this. Go ask sister-in-law yourself." Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He was upright and upright. What did he need to ask Warner for? As he was thinking, he heard a servant girl call from outside. "Young master, the mistress has woken up." Fan Xian shook his head. He knew his wife was throwing a tantrum. But Warner had always been a very graceful and pleasant woman. How could she be like those women in the harem? She knew he had worked hard to get home. If she didn't welcome him, then so be it. Instead, she closed the door on him. Thinking of this, as he walked to his room, a glimmer of anger gradually rose in his heart. But when he reached the door and heard the little Ling coming from inside, his anger immediately dissipated. On the contrary, a very interesting expression appeared on his face. The voice was clear and sweet. Who else could it be but Lin Warner? And the little Ling was also very familiar. Do you know? Do you know? It should be green and red thin. Fan Xian's expression was slightly embarrassed. The poem he had used to trick Haitang was only known to the Emperor of Northern Qi and the Empress Dowager and himself. How did it get to the capital in the south? Chapter 259. Fan Xian clenched his fist and covered his mouth with a cough. He stepped forward and pushed the door. Naturally, it swung open. He understood what was going on. Since the couple was preparing to have a good fight, there was no reason for them to close the ring and not let anyone in. Even Fan Xian's earlier cough was a reminder to his wife that he was here, and that if there was anything to say, it was best to talk about it in the room. This generation, after all, was a male-dominated society. Although Lin Warner's background was much more noble than Fan Xian's, since she had married into the Fan manor, it was reasonable to say that she would not express her dissatisfaction so directly. The way the couple interacted with each other was different from that of other official families. Although Fan Xian could not escape the control of the male animal's hormones, on a spiritual level, he still respected women. When all was said and done, this was all Fan Xian's own fault. His sister was preparing to run away from home, and his wife was a little jealous. It was all because of his influence. If this had happened in the manor, it would have long since caused a ruckus. "Young master." The servant girl Cece covered her mouth and smiled. She welcomed him in, helped him take off his outer shirt, and handed him a towel. Fan Xian waved his hand, indicating that he had already wiped it. He looked at the girl's mischievous smile, and could not help but sigh in his heart. It was not just his sister and Warner. Even this servant girl had grown up with him, and he had spoiled her to the point where she had no sense of seniority. When the family drama was going on, she still had the leisure to watch the fun, and to tease him for his courage. Lynn Warner was lying on the bed. A thin blanket had been pulled up to her chest, and her black hair was scattered on her shoulders. She looked like she had just woken up. Her large eyes rolled around, and she looked curiously and sweetly at her husband, who had just returned from a long journey. There was not a trace of anger in her eyes, as Fan Xian had prepared to welcome him. Her small nose slightly raised, and she said, "My husband, I did not go out to welcome you. Please don't take offense." Fan Xian looked at her peeking porcelain teeth and smiled. He sat down on the side of her bed and began to carry out the three-nose policy. He did not explain, hide, or speak. He put his hand under the blanket, held her slightly cold hand, and squeezed it. They had not seen each other for months, and it had been a long time since he had squeezed Warner's soft, boneless hand. He did miss it. Cece was still in the room, and Lynn Warner could not help but feel embarrassed. She glanced in that direction. Fan Xian raised his head and saw that Cece was pretending to tidy up the medicine box on the table, but her eyes were flying in his direction. He couldn't help laughing and scolding, "You little girl, I've really spoiled you. Aren't you afraid of getting a pinprick? Get out." Cece chuckled and bowed to the young master and mistress. She then pushed open the door and closed it behind her. Coincidentally, she ran into Chi, who had gone to the front of the manor to bring back a tray of food. She quickly blocked her outside. Chi was a servant girl who had followed Warner when she married and had the same status as Cece. The two of them got along well. Seeing her blocking the door, she immediately understood what the two masters inside were doing. She couldn't help but make a face. Looking at the tray of food in her hands, she said bitterly, "The young master has just returned home. He has to eat something first." Cece smiled and said, "These are just small snacks to fill his stomach. Isn't the manor in front preparing the main meal? Besides, our family's young master needs to eat something first." To Chi, these words were unavoidably frivolous, particularly since it involved the young mistress. No matter what, it shouldn't be a joke that servants like her should make. Her expression became ugly. She glared at Cece and snorted. Carrying the tray of food, she went to the room next door. Cece was slightly stunned. Then she remembered that her previous words were indeed very disrespectful. She stuck out her tongue and hurriedly ran over. After a while, after a moment of silence, there was a burst of extremely low laughter in the room next door. It seemed that the two principal maids had already reconciled. On the enormous bed in the bedroom, under the large blanket, Fan Xian stretched out his right hand and took out the hair fork on his head. At home, he always liked to comb a petal at the back of his head for freshness. He felt his mouth was a little dry. He stretched out his hand to the small table beside the bed and took out a cup of tea to moisten his throat. After thinking for a moment, he brought the teacup to Warner's lips and fed her half a cup. Warner's eyes were soft, and her cheeks were slightly flushed. After drinking half a cup of warm tea, she came back to her senses. Embarrassed and angry, she bit his left forearm and said, "How can there be someone as impatient as you? It's just nightfall. If those servants guess, how can I have the face to manage this family?" Fan Xian chuckled and turned to his side to hold his wife. His fingers gently slid along her smooth upper arm. His heart was very satisfied. He said, "Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Besides, we haven't seen each other for a long time. Who would dare to say anything when we're intimate?" His eyes turned slightly, and he mischievously said, "Besides, if I wasn't so impatient earlier, I'm afraid you would still be suspicious of what I did outside." Hearing this, Lynn Warner remembered that today she was going to try to persuade her husband. How could she have let him into the room for less than the time it takes to drink a cup of tea? She seemed to have lost her head and almost forgot what she was going to say. Could it be that her husband really did have some sort of bewitching spell? Thinking of this, she couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. She lightly hit him and said, "If you didn't mention it, I would have forgotten. I was going to ask you if you felt anything when you heard that order." Fan Xian licked his somewhat dry lips. His handsome face and this expression didn't seem obscene. Instead, it gave off an indescribable sense of naughtiness. When it came to the way of a husband and wife, he had always been a man of action. He didn't care what Warner was thinking. First, they got into bed and made out. In this world, after intimate matters, women would always be incomparably attached to their lovers, and the jealousy in their hearts would fade a little. But he also knew that there had to be an explanation for this, so he took the initiative to bring it up. "You little girl, you dare not let me into the room? Be careful that I don't spank you." Lin Warner leaned into his arms and quietly said, "If you want to spank me, then spank me. In any case, you only know how to bully me." "What do you mean by that?" Fan Xian laughed. "Are you mad at me for not bringing back chicken wings from Northern Qi?" Lin Warner got up and half knelt on the bed. Her undergarments were slightly slippery, revealing half of her shoulders. She stared into Fan Xian's eyes, and after a moment of silence, she suddenly said, "I was not happy before. In this world, even if the women were jealous, they would not be as open and aboveboard as Lin Warner." So Fan Xian was at a loss for what to do. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He could only carefully reply, "What kind of jealousy is this? That song was indeed written by me, but it's not what you think it is." "What do you mean by jealousy?" Lin Warner didn't understand what he meant. Only then did Fan Xian remember that in this world, there was no story of Lady Fong drinking jealousy and committing suicide. So he laughed and told the story, but he pretended to read it from someone else's note. After Lin Warner heard it, she also sighed at Lady Fong Xuanling's strength. But in her heart, she felt that her husband must have made up this story himself. Perhaps he had written it specifically to criticize her. She couldn't help but feel a little angry. "I'm not the kind of petty person who wants to monopolize you. Cece and Si-Chi will eventually have to enter the school. You don't have to deliberately use this story to make things difficult for me." Fan Xian knew that his wife had misunderstood him. He laughed and said, "If you don't want to monopolize me, then that's a bit inappropriate." Lin Warner was, after all, a woman who had grown up in the palace. She didn't understand the hidden meaning of her husband's words. She heard Fan Xian say, "If you weren't jealous, then why didn't you let me enter the school?" Lin Warner was still half kneeling on the bed. She puffed up her cheeks. After a while, she said, "Do you know that this song has already spread throughout the world? Everyone in the capital knows that Fan Xian, the immortal of poetry, does not compose poetry. This time, on this diplomatic mission to Northern Qi, he made an exception for a woman. It's just a song. If you want to hear it, I will naturally write one for you every day," Fan Xian said with a smile. Lin Warner faintly said, "Just a song? I hear that in Shangjing of Northern Qi, you and Haitang travel together, drink together, and stroll along the streets in the rain every day. It has already become a legend." Fan Xian felt bitter. He knew that the Emperor of Northern Qi had purposely released this information. But as these words were being passed from mouth to mouth, Lin Warner was in an awkward position. He was about to explain when his wife asked, "Husband, tell me, that girl, Haitang, what does she look like?" Fan Xian was startled. Of course, he couldn't praise Haitang to the heavens. But for some reason, deep in his heart, he didn't want to invert black and white in front of his wife and belittle Haitang to the point of being worthless, even though this was a shameless thing all men would do in their wives' beds. He thought for a moment and then said, "Haitang is the last disciple of the imperial advisor of Northern Qi, Ku He. She is most favored, and has a high status in the palace. Since I am on this diplomatic mission to benefit the country, it is only natural that I should befriend such an important person." Lin Wanner shook her head and sighed. That Haitang girl may not have much of a reputation in the south, but now everyone knows her status in the north. I only have one question, husband. Given Haitang's status, can she be a concubine? Fan Xian was startled, wondering where this wild and unconstrained question had come from. He then heard Lin Wanna sigh and say, "A woman like her must have a very high standard. If it weren't for someone of your stature, she wouldn't have taken a liking to you. But with her status, it will be difficult to make arrangements for her in the future. Wanner is angry today because you never think about the consequences of your actions. You are a bit reckless." Fan Xian laughed. "I'm not going to marry that Haitang. What consequences? Wanner's words are a bit funny." Lin Wanner turned pale with fright. For some reason, she began to sympathize with the woman called Haitang. She rebuked him. "Are you planning to abandon her?" Fan Xian waved his hand and held back his laughter. "Since there is no chaos, how can I abandon her?" A moment later, Lin Wanner looked at him with a trace of suspicion. "Really? Then why did you write poems to provoke her?" "Provoke her?" Fan Xian asked the heavens. After thinking for a while, he told his wife about the arrangements he had made before leaving the capital, as well as the many things that had happened in Shangjing. He shook his head and said, "Haitang's martial cultivation is extremely high. Aside from the 4 grandmasters, I am afraid she is one of the strongest. Since I am going to have dealings with her, of course I have to prepare some sharp weapons." Lin Wanna frowned. "Is this what you mean by, keep it in your heart?" "Exactly." Fan Xian smiled. "When 2 countries go to war, attacking the heart is the most important." After a long time, Lin Wanner sighed. "My husband's plan is a bit shameless." The disturbance at home had subsided. Fan Xian thought for a while, and then told his wife about his fight with the great prince. He knew that Wanner had grown up in the palace and had more say in matters of the court than he did. Ever since they had gotten married, he had gradually gotten used to discussing his plans with her. After hearing what he said, Lin Wanner also frowned. She came to the same conclusion as Yen Bingyun. She felt that there was no need for Fan Xian to offend the great prince. It felt unnecessary. It was impossible for Fan Xian to explain his secret worries to his wife. He could only smile warmly and say, "Wanner, don't worry about why I'm doing this. Just tell me whether or not you think this will make the palace believe that the great prince and I are enemies in the future." Lin Wanner looked at him with amusement. "It will be very difficult." Fan Xian was surprised. "Why is that?" Lin Wanner sighed. "Actually, you have been mistaken about one thing. It is true that the Overwatch Council, in the eyes of the officials and the people, is a sinister and terrifying yamen. The officials of the 6 ministries call you black dogs behind your backs, but not everyone dislikes the Overwatch Council, just like the military, the Bureau of Military Affairs, and the Western Army. They all have a good impression of the Overwatch Council." Fan Xian immediately understood. When it came to war, the most important thing was intelligence and logistics. The Overwatch Council's network of spies all over the world must have provided the military with great support. It could reduce the amount of blood shed by soldiers. Of course, the military liked the Overwatch Council. He frowned. "That is one of the reasons. But the great prince will have to hand over his military power when he returns to the capital. The military's opinion will not affect him much." Lin Wanner did not understand why he wanted the palace to think that he had not befriended the 3 princes. She sighed. "There is one more thing that perhaps you have forgotten. Of the 3 princes, the one closest to Wanner is the great prince. Even for my sake, he will not hold a grudge against you." Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He knew that when Wanner was young, she spent most of her time in the palace with Lady Ning. It was natural that she would be closest to the great prince. It was just that when he was calculating, he had intentionally or unintentionally neglected this layer of relationship. Perhaps, deep in his heart, He did not want to connect his wife with the princes. Lin Wanner knew what Fan Xian was worried about. She said gently, "I think you are worrying too much. The emperor is healthy. The situation you are worried about will probably take many years." Fan Xian sighed and pulled her into his arms. He whispered in her ear, "People who do not think about the future will have immediate worries. Looking at the atmosphere when I return to the capital, I know that when I take over the palace treasury next year, your brothers, the crown prince, the great prince, and the second prince, will not let go of a fat piece of meat like me." "How was the idea I gave you on the Tsang Mountains last year?" Lin Wanner did not seem like a 16 or 17-year-old girl. She was more like a female strategist. After all, she was the daughter of the eldest princess. In this area, she had more or less inherited some of this, so Fan Xian had always trusted her advice. But Fan Xian had never agreed to the proposal on the Tsang Mountains. He lowered his head slightly and said slowly but firmly, "Asking for power to be reduced is the most appropriate thing to do. For a young official like me to be in charge of the Overwatch Council and the palace treasury, the favor of the emperor is too great, and the power is too great. This is something that should not have happened, but Wanner, I will not let go of the palace treasury." Although Lin Wanner did not know why her husband did not want to let go of the palace treasury, as a wife, she could only silently support him. She nodded and said, "I understand." Fan Xian continued, "Since I am not willing to let go of the palace treasury, then the Overwatch Council is even more so. If the palace treasury was a mountain of gold, then the Overwatch Council was the army guarding it. If the palace treasury was empty, then Fan Xian would be a naked beauty with no sense of security at all. He would be waiting to be wantonly humiliated by the people in the palace." Lin Wanner sighed and shook her head. "Then you will have to work hard." She suddenly looked into his eyes and asked, "Are you confident?" Fan Xian smiled and gently patted her cheek. "I do not dare to say things with certainty, but you know that I have always been a somewhat arrogant and even narcissistic person." Lin Wanner smiled. She suddenly bit her thick, plump lower lip and said softly, "Actually, I have an idea." Fan Xian's interest was piqued. "What idea?" Lin Wanner's eyes flashed. No one knew what she was thinking. She quietly said, "Take Haiteng as your wife." Fan Xian turned pale with fright. He thought to himself that his wife's plan was indeed unexpected. Lin Wanner excitedly explained, "Haiteng is an upper 9th level warrior. My husband said that she might one day become a great grandmaster. Say, if we have a great grandmaster in our family, and she has the power of Ku He behind her, even the royal brothers of the kingdom of Qing would not dare to do anything to you. Even the emperor would have to try to win you over. Look at the Yi Zhong family. All they have is Yi Luyun, and they have dominated the bureaucracy for over a decade without suffering a single defeat." Fan Xian knew that what she said made sense. No matter who it was, marrying Haiteng would be like having an iron ticket in the house, a gold medal for exemption from death. But he didn't know if his wife was testing him one last time or what, so he laughed evilly and said, "But Haiteng really doesn't look that good." Lin Wanner paused for a moment, then spat at him. "You pervert." Fan Xian smiled. He was thinking about what Lin Wanner had said about the Yi family. Yi Zhong was the commander of the capital garrison, and Yi Linger was about to marry the second prince. What was the emperor thinking? A great grandmaster? If the situation really did develop this way, from Fan Xian's point of view, the people in the palace probably did not fear the great grandmaster Yi Luyun. He frowned. "When I was not in the capital, did Yi Zhong resign from the Jingdo garrison?" Lin Wanner shook her head. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and asked, "Did mother send any letters?" The mother he spoke of was naturally the eldest princess of Xinyang. Although he knew that Wanner had no feelings for that peerless beauty, in front of Wanner, he still had to be respectful. Lin Wanner still shook her head. There was no extra expression on her face. Fan Xian felt pity for her. He gently rubbed her forehead. "How have you been?" he asked quietly. "You were so focused on other things that you didn't ask about the most important thing." "I deserve a beating." Lin wanna laugh. "Master Fei comes to see me often. I'm also taking the pills. I feel pretty good." Fan Xian nodded. "It seems that recuperating in the Tsang Mountains is not bad. This winter, the whole family will live there. It's a shame we didn't soak in the hot springs last year." Their voices gradually lowered. They were whispering sweet nothings and humming a little love song. Unexpectedly, a maid called out anxiously from outside, "Young master, young mistress, it's time to eat. Master has sent word to urge us several times." Fan Xian let out a strange cry. He lifted the covers and immediately began to put on his clothes. He had originally planned to stay in the back of the residence for a while before going to pay his respects to his father. He had not expected that by trading his body for safety, he would sink into a sea of tenderness. He had completely forgotten that his father was still waiting for him in the study. When he thought of his father's solemn face, Fan Xian could imagine how angry he was. A son had traveled 1,000 miles to return home, and yet he had not paid his respects to his parents first. Instead, he had gone to fool around with his wife. Wanner complained to him as she began to dress and make up. Cece and Si-Chi had been waiting outside the door for a long time. When they heard the noise, they entered the room to serve the two mistresses. Using the fastest speed they could muster, they followed a servant carrying a lantern. They pretended nothing had happened and went to the front house. In the hall, the servant girls stood quietly to one side. The Minister of Revenue, Count Sinan, sat solemnly in the middle. Although Lady Lu had already helped him to sit, she still stood by his side out of habit, placing cups and chopstick. Fan Ruoro sat to his left, deep in thought. Fan Xizha sat to the right, his hands hidden under the table as he played with the thing Fan Xian had thrown to him earlier. Seeing Fan Xian and Lin Wanner enter, Ruoro stood up. Fan Xizha hurriedly hid the thing in his sleeves and followed his sister in saluting the two. Sitting in the middle, Fan Xian did not look at Fan Xian. Instead, he nodded to Lin Wanner. His daughter-in-law's status was somewhat special, and he could not neglect her. There were many rules in a large family, but Fan Xian was busy with official business, so he rarely had time to eat at home. Today was the first time Fan Xian had returned, so naturally he had to be more formal than usual. At the table, not a sound could be heard. With great difficulty, the meal was over. Fan Xian looked at his son and said lightly, "You are going to be made a noble." Chapter 260. First-Class Baron, Second Rank. Fan Xian pondered the weight of this title, worried that it would provoke some criticism. In truth, he was being overly cautious. Although the mission to Northern Qi was not a difficult or dangerous affair, it was still a difficult one. At the beginning of spring, His Majesty had disrespected Prime Minister Lin and Assistant Minister Fan, and had kicked him out of the capital. Although Fan Jian had been promoted to minister, giving Fan Xian the title of baron was, in the eyes of the common people, just a second compensation for the Fan family. No one was too surprised. Furthermore, ever since he had entered the capital, everyone knew that the reason the emperor of the palace admired the Fan family's son so much was largely because of his literary talent. Fan Xian was in line with His Majesty's strategy of promoting scholarly governance. This time, Fan Xian had earned a carriage full of books in Northern Qi, and His Majesty would naturally reward him. Although, given Fan Xian's current position, he did not think much of a mere baron, the title of nobility was still based on family and status. It would always have some benefits for doing things. He looked at his father and said, "When will the edict come down?" By this time, father and son had been talking for a long time in the study. Fan Xian chose to talk about some of the less secretive parts of the diplomatic mission. Every time he touched on matters of the council, Minister Fan waved his hand and told him to skip ahead before he could show any signs of awkwardness. When all was said and done, Fan Xian had grown up in Danzhou. After entering the capital, he rarely communicated with his father. Most of the time, they talked in this simple and unique study. So, when it came to feelings, it was a bit lacking. But for some reason, he looked at Fan Jian's gray hair growing on his temples and thought of the romantic figures of the northern Qi kingdom who had already been beaten by the wind and rain. His sadness carried a glimmer of guilt. The director was right. Count Sinan did not owe Fan Xian anything. Fan Xian owed him a great deal. When I enter the palace tomorrow, there will probably be an edict. Minister Fan closed his eyes, drinking the fruit juice that Lady Lu had prepared every night. He seemed to be enjoying it. You did well in the north. Director Chen has asked for much credit, and His Majesty appreciates it. On this trip to northern Qi, other than his own secret matters, he had not done anything for the court. Even Yan Bingyun's return to northern Qi was something that happened along the way. It could not be considered a contribution. He could not help but smile bitterly. Actually, on this trip back and forth, I really did not do anything. Sometimes doing nothing is the best thing to do. Minister Fan slowly opened his eyes. Fan Xian felt a chill in his heart. He thought his father was going to use this opportunity to teach him a lesson about how he had fought with the great prince outside of the capital. Unexpectedly, his father did not say a word about it. Instead, he changed the subject. I've told you many times before not to get too close to the Overwatch Council. I didn't expect you to not listen to me. You were tricked by that old dog Chen Pingping. Speaking of this, Minister Fan seemed to be really unhappy. To be able to safely guard the palace treasury is a rare opportunity in the eyes of others. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. I wish I could. The problem is, that person in Xinjiang is not willing to let it go so easily. Furthermore, she was the one who started it first. If I did not join the Overwatch Council, how could I contend with someone like that? Minister Fan sighed, thinking that he had indeed not thought through this matter thoroughly. He had not expected the eldest princess to have such a strong reaction. He could only wave his hand and say, after all, she is the Emperor's sister, the Empress Dowager's favorite daughter, and Wanner's birth mother. Let bygones be bygones. Fan Xian believed this. Although he did not believe that his father was a man who would swallow his pride, he knew that his father's loyalty to the royal family was unquestionable. He only sought his own interests for the sake of the family. Furthermore, his father had always insisted that Fan Xian stay away from the Overwatch Council. He did not want Fan Xian to get involved in the capital's complicated and sinister political struggles. But the palace treasury was banknotes and the bureaucracy was politics. Banknotes and politics had always been twins. It seemed that his father had not understood this law in the beginning. But no matter what, Fan Xian was grateful for Count Sinan's efforts. Father, please do not worry. I will be careful. Fan Xian was satisfied with his attitude. Only the truly strong have the right to show weakness. The weak have always been weak. There is no need to show weakness. Think about it yourself. Fan Xian understood what his father meant. He smiled. Suddenly, he thought of something else. Father, when I return to the capital, can I still have Gao De and the other 7 follow me? Minister Fan looked at his son, and a gentle smile appeared in his usually solemn eyes. You know that I only train and manage the tiger guards on behalf of the royal family. The real power lies in the palace. If you want to keep those tiger guards, I can only go to the palace and speak for you. But I don't think His Majesty will allow it. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. In his heart, he did not want to part with Gao De and the other 7 tiger guards. With these silent masters as bodyguards, his safety would be greatly guaranteed. On the meadow outside Wudu, even Haitang could not gain the slightest advantage against the 7 tiger guards. Compared to the swordsman of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, this was a level higher. Not to mention the Chinian unit that he had first established. The Chinian unit was his most loyal force. Although under Wang Qinyan's tutelage, whether it was tracking intelligence or other matters, they had slowly taken shape. Unfortunately, they were still a bit weak in terms of martial prowess. But he also understood that the Tiger Guards had always been used as bodyguards for princes. For example, there were a few in the Western Army, and they were responsible for the great prince's safety. Although His Majesty would occasionally transfer the Tiger Guards to the side of certain ministers, those were special missions. For example, when Fan Xian's father-in-law, Prime Minister Lin, resigned and returned to his hometown, His Majesty had sent 4 Tiger Guards to accompany him. This was to commend the Prime Minister for his lifetime of service to the country, and to ensure the Prime Minister's safety on the road. After these specific tasks were completed, the Tiger Guards would return to the capital, disappearing into inconspicuous private residences. Fan Xian knew so much because Fan Jian had always been responsible for handling these matters for His Majesty. Since the diplomatic mission had returned to the capital, if the Tiger Guards continued to follow him and the royal family found out, it would inevitably cause a lot of trouble. Minister Fan looked at the regretful expression on his son's face and couldn't help but smile. Although this child had the style of his mother, and his talent was extraordinary, he was still only a young man. He couldn't help but remind Fan Xian, when you left, that scholar Shi Chanli often came to pay his respects. I met him a few times, and he really is a talented person who doesn't show it. Fan Xian was startled, but then he understood. After his father knew that he had decided not to ask for a reduction in power and leave the Overwatch Council, he began to plan for his future in the bureaucracy. This was to remind him not to forget about his student. Although Fan Xian's position in the hearts of the world's scholars had been established, and the students his father-in-law had left behind in the court could help him, as time went on, he needed some of his own people to speak in the court. Understanding his father's thoughts, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel moved. But as a man, he learned not to show his emotions. He only bowed deeply to his father. Minister Fan waved his hand, signaling him to return to his room. Fan Xian thought about it. Regarding his sister's marriage, it was best not to speak too soon. Such arrangements could only be made slowly, and so he respectfully left the room. Watching Fan Xian straight back as he left the study, Minister Fan couldn't help but show some pride and comfort in his eyes. With a son like this, what more could a father ask for? He gently drank the last drop of fruit juice in the bowl. He knew in his heart that this child had long since guessed something. But with this child's temperament, since the other party did not say anything, it naturally did not matter. The future of the Fan clan depended on this child. Thinking of this, Minister Fan couldn't help but admire Prime Minister Lin, who was already far from the center of power in the kingdom of Qing. He thought that old Fox's luck was quite good. Minister Fan had paid a heavy price and worked hard for more than 10 years, while Prime Minister Lin had only given birth to a daughter. September was dull and boring. Everything was fine except for the worry. Fan Xian sat in the carriage, gently knocking on the wooden window lattice, humming a song that no one else could understand to the strange rhythm. Entering the palace was a serious matter for most officials, but he only felt bored. It was the first time he had returned to the capital, and he had made up his mind with his wife and father. He felt that there was nothing to worry about in the entire court, both inside and outside the capital. In a moment, he would enter the palace to receive his title, Kowtow, and then go to the council to sort out his affairs. It seemed that all he could do was return to Tsang Mountain to practice jumping off the cliff. His fingers, which had been knocking on the window lattice, suddenly froze. He suddenly remembered his sister's marriage, and remembered that Li Hongqing was holding a feast on Lujing River to welcome him. His expression suddenly became unsightly. So this dull and boring September was actually such a dog's life. Today was the day of the court. Early in the morning, many officials had arrived at the palace gates to wait. It was said that in the early years, some of the older officials, in order to show their loyalty to the emperor, began to prepare their court attire in the middle of the night. They hurried to the palace gates before dawn, just to wait for the sound of the palace gates opening. After these old officials retired, not being able to hear the creaking of the gates for many nights made them feel particularly uncomfortable. Now that the emperor was on the throne, he hated those who sought fame. So the officials did not dare to come too early, but they also did not dare to come too late. It was unknown who had the idea, but some of the officials actually reserved seats in the tea-house at the corner of Shinjuku. As soon as the sun had risen, they left the manor and waited in the private rooms of the tea-house. They had their attendants watch the palace gates from afar, so that they could line up at the right time. There was no such thing as a commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Aside from the mysterious figure that had long since been forgotten, Fan Xian was the first commissioner since the founding of the Kingdom of Qing. That was why he was only a fourth-level official in the Imperial College. If it were not for the fact that the emperor had to report to the diplomatic mission, he would not have had the right to attend court. So he did not need to wear court attire for half a day. Early in the morning, he set out from Fan Manor, leisurely all the way. When he arrived at the palace gates, he was much later than most of the other officials. Popularity attracts jealousy, and this was especially true for a young man who had only been in the capital for a year and a half. Furthermore, this young man had torn the faces of most of the officials in the capital, killed a minister, and chased away another. As the saying goes, the turtle responds when the turtle cries, and the fox grieves when the rabbit dies. Everyone looked at this handsome commissioner of the Overwatch Council, yawning as he got out of the carriage. Their eyes were filled with caution and disgust. Fan Xian looked around and felt that the atmosphere was not quite right. These officials were either ministers of various ministries or officials of various temples. They were all second-level officials and above, whose wife did not have a title of nobility, and whose home did not have a few toys bestowed by the emperor. He was so young, and yet he had arrived later than these officials. If he did not have Minister Fan behind him, especially that old cripple, these truly high-ranking officials of the Kingdom of Qing would have cursed him out a long time ago. Naturally, he could not curse them, but the officials would not give him a good look either. They coldly glanced at him, and arrogantly turned their heads away. Among the officials, there were a few who had been promoted by Lin Ruofu. They had wanted to go up and talk to Fan Xian and comfort him, but seeing the disdainful gazes of their colleagues, they couldn't help but feel a headache coming on. So, they stopped in their steps and only used gentle gazes to greet Fan Xian. Fan Xian felt very uncomfortable being swept by these heated gazes, but he still maintained a calm smile on his face. Neither servile nor overbearing, he cupped his hands and greeted the officials. As he cupped his hands, someone behind him coughed. For some reason, Minister Fan had arrived a little late today, and had not come with his son. Fan Xian quickly went up to greet him, and carefully helped his father down from the carriage. Minister Fan looked at him and shook his head. "I am not that old yet." Fan Xian smiled. He knew that he had gone a little overboard with his acting. Although Minister Fan looked a little unhappy, the officials could see that old Qian Lotzi was unusually happy today. He did not even let go of his son's hand and led him over. With Minister Fan personally leading the way, the officials could no longer boast. They all greeted each other. After a short while, Count Sinan had led Fan Xian around the court, allowing him to recognize all the powerful officials in the court. Fan Xian called them uncles, elders, and so on. When the officials looked at the smiling young man again, they found him to be much more pleasing to the eye. The officials who belonged to the Lin faction were even more affectionate, praising Fan Xian for being young and promising, and so on and so forth. but there were still some officials who looked on coldly. Although they bowed, their faces were cold. After all, everyone in the kingdom of Qing knew that Sir Fan Jr. was most famous for his seemingly gentle, but actually sinister smile. The Minister of Appointments, who had been a veteran of 3 dynasties, saw the Fan father and son approach. He could not help but snort coldly. Since the founding of the kingdom of Qing, and even during the reign of the Wei family, it is rare for 2 sons and daughters to attend court at the same time like Count Sinan's. Fan Xian laughed. The Emperor's grace is like the sea, the Emperor's grace is like the sea. It was as if he could not hear the mockery in the other's words. He gave all the glory to the Emperor. Fan Xian smiled. He knew that there was no room for him to speak on such an occasion, so he simply kept quiet. At that moment, 3 eunuchs slowly walked out of the palace gates. The one in the middle was clearly of a higher rank. He waved the horsetail whisk in his hand and said softly, "You have worked hard. Please, everyone." The officials immediately stopped exchanging pleasantries. They tidied up their court robes and walked through the palace gates. Perhaps it was because they were used to being here, but they did not even bother to look at the imperial guards at the palace gates and the armed guards at the inner gate. In a moment they passed the 3 eunuchs, their heads held high and their chests puffed out. They had the air of the masters of the country. It was the first time Fan Xian had attended court, and it was not convenient for him to walk with his father. He could only pathetically drag himself to the back of the line and walk inside with the 3 eunuchs. The eunuch in the lead was Eunuch Ho, whom he was familiar with, but Fan Xian did not dare say anything to him, and it was even more impossible for him to casually hand over a banknote. He could only smile at him in acknowledgement. A long time later, Ho Sanner still thought about this question. Why did he think that Sir Fan was a trustworthy supporter from the very beginning? In the end, he concluded that every time Sir Fan looked at him, his smile was very sincere. He was not like the other officials, who would deliberately show him warmth when they needed him. Other times, although he smiled warmly, there was always a hint of disdain in that smile that made people feel uncomfortable. It was Fan Xian's first time attending a court conference, so he couldn't help feeling nervous. However, he stood at the very end of the civil officials and was still far from the dragon chair. If it were not for his tyrannical internal strength and exceptional hearing, he probably wouldn't even have heard what the Emperor said. He knew that the middle-aged man on the dragon chair would certainly notice him, but he still relaxed slightly and began to examine the decorations inside Taiji Palace. Although he had entered the palace a few times, most of his time was spent in the back of the palace, talking with the concubines and touring the mountains with Wanner. This Taiji Palace was the main palace of the royal palace, and he had only seen it from afar. He had never had the opportunity to stand inside. Now that he had entered, he found it to be nothing special. The beams were exquisitely carved with dragons and phoenixes, and the red pillars were imposing. A faint fragrance wafted through the spacious palace, and bronze cranes and strange beasts stood to the side. But compared to the palace of northern Qi, where the sky, water, and color of wealth and beauty merged into one, it paled in comparison. But this palace had a different aura. It seemed to be the smell of power, rising from the dragon throne and making the officials feel awe. It had nothing to do with the dragon throne. The middle-aged man sitting on the dragon throne was the source of this aura. Although his palace was not as grand as northern Qi's, and his food was not as exquisite as Dongyi's, everyone knew that he was the most powerful man in the world. The main topic of the court meeting naturally could not be separated from the great prince and the diplomatic group. But it was not about the fight for the road outside the city. Even if the imperial censorate wanted to do something about it, they could not bring out a memorial today. It was not that the imperial censorate did not have the ability to rush a memorial overnight, but if they were to rush it, they would probably leave traces and make the emperor unhappy. Today's court meeting discussed the future arrangements of the Western Army, as well as the soldiers' requests for rewards. The great prince had already been made a king, but the 100,000 soldiers under his command had to be accounted for. This point was brought up by the Bureau of Military Affairs, and no one would raise any objections. Although the emperor placed great emphasis on the rule of literature, the kingdom of Qing was, after all, a valiant nation built on military might. No one would make life difficult for the military on this matter. As for the diplomatic group, after reporting on what had happened along the way, the Chamberlain of Dependencies presented the letter of credence on behalf of the Northern Qi delegation, presenting the newly drawn map of the world. Looking at the gradually expanding territory of the kingdom of Qing on the map, the emperor, who had always seemed too calm, finally had a glimmer of passion in his eyes. The officials knew what was good for them, and naturally, they cheered loudly and flattered the emperor. The elders of the Bureau of Military Affairs stroked their beards proudly. This was the land that the sons of the army had fought for with their own blood and flesh. At this time, not many officials realized that in the process of negotiations, the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies, including Xian Chiwu, Fan Xian, and the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, had played a large role. Even if they realized it, they would purposely ignore it. Fan Xian looked at the joy in the hearts of the officials in court. Involuntarily, a slight smile rose to the corners of his lips. After all, he had once participated in this major event. He thought that if the eldest princess had not sold Yan Bingyun out, the kingdom of Qing would probably have gained even more. But the eldest princess had turned around and tossed Xiao En back to Northern Qi, causing the Northern Qi court to gradually develop signs of internal strife. The ruler and officials were at odds with each other, and this was a very powerful move. Comparing the two, the only difference was short-term benefits versus long-term benefit. The most powerful middle-aged man in the world, after a burst of uncontrollable faint joy in his heart, immediately regained his calmness with great self-control. Supporting his chin with his hand, he wore a smile on his face as he listened to the praises of his subjects. His gaze, however, swept across the back of the ranks of his subjects indifferently. After seeing the smile on that little fellow's face, his mood somehow became a little better. He waved his hand, and the eunuch holding the brush and the head of the secretariat began to recite the already drafted edict in a sharp voice. Because there were too many soldiers to be rewarded, and the opinions of the great prince and the elders of the military had to be consulted, it had to be delayed for some time. This edict was mainly for the members of the diplomatic mission. The hall fell silent. Everyone knew that after the diplomatic mission, it was just a routine reward, and the officials did not care. They only pricked up their ears to hear Fan Xian's name from the eunuch's sharp voice. Baron of the first rank, second rank. The officials all breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that His Majesty still had a sense of propriety. Regardless of their relationship with the Fan family, these officials did not want Fan Xian to be given such a high title at such a young age. Everyone thought in different directions and stood in different positions, but their thoughts were very similar. Xian Chiwu, Fan Xian, and the others had long since knelt in the hall and thanked the emperor for his grace. Just as the officials were about to hear the words, "If there is something to report, if there is nothing to report, the court is dismissed," His Majesty sat on the dragon chair and said lightly, "The few of you stay." His Majesty's gaze fell on the few high-ranking officials closest to the dragon chair. After Lin Ruofu resigned as Prime Minister, the court could not find a suitable candidate to replace him, so the current affairs of the cabinet were handled by a few scholars and ministers. These days, after court meetings, His Majesty would often ask them to stay and say a few more words. Today, the Crown Prince and the Great Prince were also in the hall, so they naturally had to stay and say a few words. So the officials did not feel that anything was amiss. After greeting the emperor, they all retreated from the hall. Then, these officials heard something that made them feel incomparably jealous and envious. "Fan Xian, you stay as well." Chapter 261. With strange expressions on their faces, the officials walked past Fan Xian and exited Taiji Palace. At this moment, Fan Xian felt a little uneasy. He knew what the situation of the conversation in front of the Emperor would be. Even if he was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, he would probably stand out. In the end, his experience and age were too young. But since things had come to this, he could only accept it calmly. With a trace of caution, he followed behind the old officials and followed the eunuch to the back of the palace. After a few turns and 2 turns, they didn't walk very far. They came to a side hall. The ceiling was blocked, so the space didn't seem very spacious. To the left was a large row of wooden shelves that were as tall as a person. The shelves were all filled with books. Fan Xian secretly looked around at the decorations. He knew that this was probably the legendary royal study. A smile appeared at the corner of his lips. He was probably thinking of the braid plays he had often seen in his previous life. At this time, the Emperor had already taken off his dragon robe with the help of the eunuchs. He had changed into a sky-blue casual shirt with a jade belt tied around his waist. He looked quite casual. The Emperor reclined on the low couch and reached out to place a teacup on the table. He casually waved his hand, and the eunuchs hurriedly brought 7 round chairs with embroidered surfaces into the room. The 7 old officials bowed to express their thanks and naturally took their seat. The Crown Prince and the Great Prince stood next to the low couch that the Emperor was sitting on. Although there were no seats, one could tell from the expressions on their faces that this had always been the rule. However, there had always been 7 chairs in advance. Today there was an additional young official. The eunuchs of the royal study had probably never seen Fan Xian before, so they were in a bit of a dilemma. They didn't know if he was just a low-ranking official who had been sent in for questioning or some other noble figure. Everyone was sitting and Fan Xian was standing alone. This immediately made him stand out. His father, Minister Fan, was looking at his nose and did not even glance at him. Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh self-mockingly. He moved his already inconspicuous position further back. His small action was noticed by the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince smiled slightly at him. Fan Xian only dared to return the gesture with his gaze. Inadvertently, he saw the Great Prince give a small yawn behind the Emperor. He had probably just returned to the capital yesterday and had drunk a lot of wine. He was probably very tired today. Other than the day when they first met in the tea-house by the Lujing River, today was the closest Fan Xian had ever been to the Emperor. He was so close that he could almost touch the Emperor. He couldn't help but raise his head slightly and quickly sweep his eyes over the Emperor, but he didn't dare to stare at him. After all, the other party was the Emperor. Although there was an official called Mu Tianyan in the Qing dynasty, no one dared to wantonly appreciate him as if he was a beauty. But it was this quick glance that allowed Fan Xian to clearly see the other's face. He was almost stunned by the look in her eyes. The Emperor glanced at him and did not mind his direct stare. Fan Xian's expression showed that he was lucky, but there was no fear in his heart. After a while, the second prince, who was studying with the little prince in Xingqing Palace, was also invited over by a eunuch. When he entered the royal study, he was still holding the little prince's hand. Seeing the harmonious scene between the 2 brothers, the Emperor nodded slightly, seemingly satisfied. The Crown Prince had a smile on his face, but who knew how many profanities he was cursing in his heart? Bring Fan Xian a seat. After the 4 princes all stood next to the low couch, the Emperor seemed to notice that Fan Xian was still standing, and casually ordered him. Fan Xian was slightly surprised. I wouldn't dare. Given his rank, entering the royal study was already an exception. These 4 princes were still standing, so how could he dare to sit? When the 6 old officials heard the Emperor give this young man a seat, they also felt an itch under their buttocks. They moved, twisted, and coughed. It was clear that they were somewhat dissatisfied. They had been in the court for at least 20 years before they finally had a seat in front of the emperor. Fan Xian, this child of the Fan family, had just entered the royal study and already had a seat. The crown prince looked at the officials and respectfully said to the emperor, "Father, Fan Xian is young, and his body is not as strong as the old officials. Look at how frightened he is. It is better for him to stand." These words were spoken very calmly, and whether it was the old officials or Fan Xian, they all felt grateful. At this time, the great prince spoke again and said, "I remember back then when you had us listen to the officials discuss the state, we had to stand because we were going to assist the crown prince in ruling the country and bringing peace to the world. Since it was a lesson, then the students had to act like students." He did not finish, but the meaning was already clear. Fan Xian was young and had just entered officialdom. What achievements did he have? What ability did he have for us princes to treat him like a teacher? The old officials also stroked their beards and shook their heads. This seat looked normal, but the meaning hidden within it was no small matter. They dared to guarantee that if Fan Xian actually had a seat in the royal study, the news would spread throughout Jingdou in less than 3/4 of an hour. Fan Xian was preparing to go with the flow and thank the emperor. Unexpectedly, he saw the indifferent gaze the emperor cast his way. His heart trembled slightly, and he swallowed his words. The emperor glanced at the officials and then at his eldest son, who, although straightforward, had a slightly impatient temperament. He said, "Naturally, Fan Xian does not deserve this seat, but today, he must sit. It is not to reward him, but to reward him for his service." No one understood what he meant, but since the emperor had spoken, the royal study was naturally silent. The emperor gazed at his sons and said in a gentle voice, "If you can also bring back a carriage full of books from Zhuang Mohan's family, I will let you sit as well." Everyone was silent. They all knew what this carriage represented. Although they still felt that the emperor was a bit prejudiced when it came to scholarly fame, they did not know how to argue. The emperor knew what everyone was thinking and said coldly, "Don't think that this is only a matter of scholars. What is a scholar? You officials are all scholars. I don't lack martial arts, what I lack is the art of governing the country. It's easy to unify the world, but it's difficult to unify the people's hearts. If I don't work hard on this, I won't be able to do it just by relying on swift swords and swift horses." The great prince's face clearly showed his disapproval, but his father had not finished speaking, so he did not dare to say anything. He listened as the emperor continued unhurriedly, "You can immediately take over the world, but you cannot immediately rule it. The art of literature seems illusory, but it involves the hearts of all the scholars under heaven. Back in the day, I went on 3 northern expeditions, beating the Wei family into a mess. Who would have thought that the Zhan family would take advantage of the chaos to rise? In just a few years, they gathered a large group of talents, and that is how the court of northern Qi today came to be. They have stopped our horses from marching north. What do they rely on? They rely on their rightful position in the hearts of all the scholars under heaven. The world is in the right mood? Wasn't this the work of scholars? Shu Wu Yen Hangshu. You are officials of the kingdom of Qin, but you took the imperial examinations in Northern Wei. Why is that?" Shu the scholar and minister Yen hurriedly stood up, fearful and uneasy. The emperor waved his hand and said, "All the scholars under heaven are like this. I do not blame you, and you do not need to doubt yourselves. I just want to tell you that the world is in the right mood, and the loyalty of the scholars will bring many benefits. Each county will have more talented and virtuous officials, and you will also have an advantage in speech." He looked at his eldest son and said coldly, "I know what you are thinking, but if when you send out your troops, there will be less resistance, and fewer soldiers under your rule will die, do you not want that?" The great prince was silent. The emperor then said coldly, "A carriage of old books can help me attract more scholars to travel the world, and can help me save the lives of countless soldiers. Why can't I give Fan Xian this seat?" Everyone felt that it was a bit strange. It seemed that the emperor was deliberately showing his favor to the world, and why did Minister Fan not come out to take the seat on his son's behalf? But the entire kingdom of Qing was born in the flames of war, and its people had an overwhelming fanaticism and a sense of mission to unify the world. Since the emperor had linked the books that Fan Xian brought back from this diplomatic mission to the general trend of unifying the world, who dared to say anything more? They all stood up and praised the emperor's wisdom. What direct relationship could a carriage have with the world? Fan Xian thanked the emperor for the seat. His face was calm, and he sat as steady as a mountain. He laughed bitterly in his heart, not understanding why the emperor wanted to put him on top of a fire cage to roast. The red velvet cloth was pulled back, revealing a large map inside. The map had been rearranged. The yellow territory of the kingdom of Qing was continuously extending toward the northeast, and other than the wasteland behind her, everything else was hers. The kingdom of Qing's territory was expanding rapidly. Although northern Qi still looked like a giant, in front of the wild beast that was the kingdom of Qing, it was bloated. Although northern Qi was also a new country, it had not only inherited the vast territory of the Wei Kingdom, but it had also inherited the Wei Kingdom's already rotten bureaucracy and customs. Fan Xian looked at the map and listened to the incessant sounds of discussion. Standing in the heart of the kingdom of Qing, it was the first time he felt the kingdom of Qing's valiant style of doing things and wild ambitions. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The court in the north still had power. Looking at the thoughts of Haitang and the emperor, once the world was in chaos, the people of the world would inevitably suffer, and he didn't know how long it would take to recover. Although he was not a pacifist who bemoaned the state of the universe and pitted the fate of mankind, he had no interest in such things as war. At this moment, the emperor was discussing important matters of state with a few officials. Occasionally, he would hear a few words about the defense of the river embankments, as well as the annual income and the tributes of the small vassal states. Fan Xian knew nothing of these matters, and naturally, he would not interrupt. Even if he had thoughts sitting on the tiger stool, he would not say a word. Unintentionally or unintentionally, everyone had forgotten about him in a corner of the imperial study. That was why he had the leisure to look at the obviously improved map and stare blankly at it, sighing like a disciple of the Mahist family. Suddenly, a word jumped into his ears: the palace treasury. He frowned slightly, and his heart gradually grew wary. The emperor had asked him to stay, and it was not as simple as giving him a stool and giving him face. As you all know, although the palace treasury is called the palace treasury, it is connected to many vital points, the emperor said hatefully. These years, the palace treasury has been in an embarrassing situation. In the third year of the new calendar, when the rivers in the south were dredged, and the north was cold, I ordered the palace treasury to transfer silver to the national treasury. Who knew? The Guanghui treasury could not even produce silver. The Guanghui treasury was one of the 10 treasuries of the palace treasury that specialized in storing banknotes, but the gold and silver should be stored in the undertaking treasury. The emperor's anger seemed to have been directed at the wrong person. But no matter what, the undertaking treasury and the Guanghui treasury were jointly managed by the eldest princess and the Ministry of Revenue. Although the Ministry of Revenue did not dare say a word in these 10 years, the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, quickly stood up and apologized. The emperor waved his hand and did not even look him in the eye. He continued, "The new policy has come to an end, but I have decided to make an issue of the palace treasury. I do not seek to restore the prosperity of 10 years ago, but at least every year, I want to earn some silver for the court." His voice was not loud, and his tone was not very intense, but the power contained within made everyone afraid to speak. "My royal sister has returned to Xinjiang, and there needs to be a high-ranking official to handle this matter. What good candidates do you have in mind? Report them to me. The officials and princes in the royal study all knew that this was just a formality. The capital had long known that the emperor's preferred candidate was Fan Xian, who was sitting quietly in the back. And the emperor had borrowed a vehicle to show off, and vigorously supported Fan Xian to the throne. It was nothing more than a way to show his stance to the officials, so that they would not sing a different tune when it came to choosing the person in charge of the palace treasury. But everyone knew that the situation of the palace treasury was not as bad as the emperor had made it out to be. Every year, the goods that were shipped from Jiangnan to the north earned at least a few million liang of silver for the court. If it were not for the secret business of the palace treasury, the kingdom of Qing would not have the financial resources to expand everywhere. For a moment, a faint jealousy of the Fan family grew. But since the emperor appeared to be so dissatisfied, no matter who took over the palace treasury in the future, they would probably have a headache over the amount of money to hand over every year. Thinking of this, the officials' jealousy and hatred faded a little. But even so, no one was willing to suggest Fan Xian at this time. This was a matter of face and also a matter of money. No matter how difficult it was to manage the palace treasury, the person in charge would still reap a lot of profit every year. These officials also received generous rewards from Xinyang every year, so how could they not know? The officials did not say anything, and Fan Jian, due to his status, could not recommend his own son. For a moment, the royal study fell into an awkward silence. The emperor did not say anything. He only picked up his teacup and took a small sip. His expression was normal, but no one noticed the coldness in his eyes. I recommend, everyone in the royal study was shocked. The silence had been broken by two people at the same time, and the two people who spoke at the same time were the crown prince and the second prince. This situation was fascinating. The emperor nodded slightly and said, "Speak." The second prince glanced at the crown prince and smiled slightly apologetically. "Since the crown prince has a good candidate, I am all ears." The emperor glanced at him and did not say anything. The crown prince saw that the second prince was being modest. As the master of the Eastern Palace and the future emperor of Qing, he naturally would not pass on this responsibility. He bowed to his father and said, "Father, I recommend Fan Xian." Everyone in the royal study knew that the Eastern Palace had spared no effort in pulling Fan Xian in. Furthermore, this kind of favor was something they could do at little cost. Unexpectedly, the emperor did not immediately express his stance. Instead, he asked the second prince, "Who are you going to recommend?" The second prince smiled shyly and said, "I am also going to recommend Fan Xian, Sir Fan." The royal study was still quiet, but the emperor swept a meaningful glance over Fan Xian. Fan Xian's expression did not change. He prepared to rise and respond. Unexpectedly, the emperor did not give him the opportunity. He lightly said, "Since you two brothers think Fan Xian can do it, then it is him. After autumn, we will draft an edict. There is no need to send it to the various provinces." With this, the topic was settled. Although this was something that had been decided in the palace when Fan Xian and Lin Wana married last year, it had been brought up in the royal study and recorded. Naturally, it could not be changed. Thinking of the Fan family's father controlling the national treasury and son controlling the palace treasury, everyone felt a strange feeling in their hearts. This kind of royal favor, this kind of honor, there was no other family in the capital. Looking at the crown prince and the second prince fighting to hand over to Fan Xian, they knew that the status of the Fan family in the years to come would probably only rise and not fall. It was like adding oil to a raging fire. Fan Jian and Fan Xian, father and son, quickly rose to give their thanks and repeatedly expressed their fear. The emperor did not pay them much attention. Instead, he smiled and asked, "Since it has been decided, Then I have come to ask you too. Why do you both favor Fan Xian? The Crown Prince thought for a moment and then smiled. I only have a rough idea. Minister Fan has managed the finances of the country and has been very effective. Since Fan Xian is his son, I think he should have some talent in this area. The second prince also smiled and said, I also think so. Besides, the palace treasury involves many gold, silver, and silver objects. It needs a clean and honest official to manage it. I will say something rashly. Nowadays, in the officialdom, corruption is the norm. Although there are famous clean and honest officials in each province, most of them are in the local areas. Sir Fan Jr. is brimming with talent. Everyone knows he is a man of literature and nobility. I think it is appropriate for him to manage the palace treasury. The Emperor's expression did not change. He asked, That makes sense. Is there any other reason? The Crown Prince and the second prince looked at each other, feeling a little confused. Could it be that the Emperor was using this opportunity to test them? The arrow was knocked on the bowstring, and it had to be fired. The Crown Prince could only brace himself and say, Second brother is right. Furthermore, the supervision of the palace treasury has always been the responsibility of the Overwatch Council. Since Sir Fan is the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, I think it will be much more convenient for the two departments to work together. The little prince, who had come in with the second prince, had been standing for a long time. His feet were a little sore. Perhaps he did not understand what the white-bearded officials were saying to his father, so he could not help but feel a little tired. In his days, he felt a little strange. He laughed and said in a childish voice, Brother Crown Prince, according to what you say, Fan Xian is supervising himself? He was a child, so he could speak a little more freely. Others would only think that he was speaking childishly. But it seemed like he was speaking carelessly, but it pointed out the Crown Prince's mistake. Although the officials did not dare to speak, the Crown Prince's face was slightly sullen. Fortunately, the second prince was also distressed. Father, I really cannot think of anything. The Emperor did not rebuke the Crown Prince. He only said lightly, You cannot think of anything? Then why did you want to protect him earlier? The people in the royal study saw the Emperor's hesitation. He clearly had his heart set on Fan Xian, but he still wanted to make trouble for his two sons. They felt that the Emperor's heart was hard to predict, so they could only keep their mouths shut for fear of causing trouble. As the person involved, Fan Xian felt that the tiger stool under his buttocks was not only pricking, but also burning his buttocks. At this moment, the second prince spoke with a trace of unease. Actually, there is another reason. Because I have a good personal relationship with Sir Fan. The Emperor looked at his second son calmly. After a moment, he suddenly laughed. His laughter seemed very comfortable. There are thousands of reasons, but this one is enough. What is this palace treasury? It is the treasury of the royal family. Since Fan Xian is in charge of the palace treasury, he naturally needs to be close enough to the royal family. Since Fan Xian has worked at Taichung Temple, this closeness is enough. Of course it was enough. No matter what, Fan Xian was a princess consort. No matter what, the Crown Prince and the second prince often called him brother-in-law. The Crown Prince listened to this and couldn't help but sigh. He thought that the second prince was indeed amazing. He had actually guessed the answer that the Emperor wanted. Why was he a bit slower? Because the army had just returned and the borders had just been settled, today's meeting was a bit longer than usual. It was actually past lunchtime. The Emperor looked at the time and ordered the eunuchs to prepare food. He had the officials and princes stay behind to eat together. This was the first time Fan Xian had eaten something made by the royal kitchen. He didn't think there was anything special about it. It was just some vegetables, fish, and chicken. What made him feel even more comfortable was that eating with the Emperor was not as uncomfortable as he had imagined. He didn't have to kowtow again before eating. The crown prince's and the second prince's earlier words all fell into his ears. He knew he couldn't hide. When he looked again at the middle-aged man on the dragon couch, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of wariness and coldness in his heart. The emperor's favor was based on some absurd fact, but he didn't think that an emperor would have such a rare thing as family. Fan Xian was not a person who was easy to control. He could kneel, endure, and listen. However, when something threatened his bottom line, he would smile and touch his left calf. He could not kneel, endure, or listen. He would only say, "Fuck you." The crown prince and the princes obediently waited on the emperor as he ate. They then went to eat in the side palace. The emperor was chatting with a few old officials. Naturally, they didn't talk about national affairs at the table. Instead, they talked about whose well water was the best to make tea, which province's watermelons were as big as boulders, and so on. Occasionally, they would mention the world's gossip. Naturally, they couldn't help but mention the death of Zhuang Mohan. Everyone's voices seemed to grow dim. Other than Shu the scholar and Yan Hangshu, these high-ranking officials of the Qing kingdom and even the emperor had memorized Master Zhuang's strategies during their initiation. In short, this meal was much more relaxing than the family banquets at Fan Manor. Fan Xian was a bit hungry and didn't listen to the conversation. He picked up a long soup bean sprout with his chopsticks and brought it to his mouth. Suddenly, he heard the emperor point at him and say, "Fan Xian, come here." Fan Xian put down his chopsticks and reluctantly glanced at the fragrant bean sprouts in soup. A bright smile appeared on his face, and he quickly walked to the side of the emperor's low couch. Looking at the thin but heroic face, his eyes showed just the right amount of excitement and sadness, and he cupped his hands in salute. The old officials didn't know why the emperor had called him over, and they listened with curiosity. The emperor smiled and looked at him. "Do you still remember that day in the tea-house by the Lujing River? What did I promise you?" Fan Xian hadn't expected that the emperor would talk about the coincidental encounter in front of these high officials. He smiled and said, "I didn't know it was you that day, Your Majesty, and I even exchanged a blow with Commander Gong. I offended Your Majesty, and I deserve to die." The Minister of Appointments, relying on his reputation as a senior statesman of 3 dynasties, stroked his beard and said, "So Your Majesty and Master Fan met outside the palace." When the Emperor of the Kingdom of Qing was discussing matters of state, he didn't seem angry, but now he seemed very easygoing. He chuckled and told the officials what had happened that day. Fan Jian thought to himself that this was absurd, and had no choice but to ask His Majesty to forgive his son for his offense. The other elders of the court were muttering to themselves that it was no wonder Fan Xian was so deeply favored by His Majesty. It turned out that he had such a fortuitous encounter, and that his luck was a little too good. They couldn't help but wonder what His Majesty had promised Fan Xian. "I once said that I would make a good marriage for your sister." The emperor looked at Fan Xian with a very gentle gaze, with a hint of pride that an emperor shouldn't have. "Now that Miss Fan has been promised to Crown Prince Jing, what do you think of this marriage?" Fan Xian's heart was filled with bitterness, but his face was full of gratitude. He thanked his father again and again. The old officials next to him, after a moment of surprise, also began to flatter him. They said that the emperor had met an official by the riverside, and that a marriage had been fated. It was a story that would be passed down through the ages. His voice was a bit loud, and it reached the ears of the princes who were eating in the next room. The great prince frowned, but the crown prince smiled, feeling even more confident that his decision to win over the Fan family was a wise one. He looked at his second brother's face, and found that his expression hadn't changed. He was still as calm and unhurried as he had been all these years. He even seemed a bit strange, as he chewed his food slowly and continuously. He couldn't help but curse his hypocrisy in his heart. Inside and outside the palace where the royal study was, There was laughter and the sound of praising the emperor, who knew the troubles and pain in Fan Xian's heart. When Fan Xian stepped out of the palace in the afterglow of the sun, he saw the crown prince on horseback at the entrance of the new street. His troubles grew. Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongqing, came to greet him with a face full of joy. His face showed the joy of meeting again after a long time, and there was no real emotion in his heart. The sun was setting in the west, and night was coming. Chapter 262. In a corner of the square outside the palace, on a street that connected to Xinjiku, one could vaguely see a bashful crescent moon hanging in the sky. In the dusk, Li Hongqing dismounted from his horse and casually cupped his hands in greeting. He looked at his friend, who was as pretty as a woman, and couldn't help but smile. "I see that your face is glowing with a red light. It's indescribably colorful. I think you must have gained a lot today." Fan Xian laughed. "We haven't seen each other in months, and the first thing you say is to make fun of me. You are the crown prince of King Jing, the fifth most powerful young master in the capital. Why make life difficult for a poor person like me?" Other than the four princes, among the younger generation, Li Hongqing's status was naturally the most respected. Fan Xian had purposely placed him as the fifth young master. If it had been a normal friendship, it would inevitably have seemed frivolous. But between the two of them it seemed very intimate. Li Hongqing was a little surprised. This guy had always been too lazy to provoke me in the capital. His gentle smile always carried a trace of deeply hidden loneliness. Why had his personality changed today? Thinking of something, he thought he understood and laughed. "You also have a poor life? His Majesty dotes on you so much that, after the court discussion, he deliberately kept you here. I'm afraid that the officials in the capital would grit their teeth and bear such a hard life." Fan Xian waved his hand and said nothing. Ting Zijing, who had been waiting outside the palace, had long since come to greet them. But seeing that the crown prince was talking to the young master, he didn't dare interrupt. "Young master," he hurriedly said, "the old master told me to follow you." Li Hongqing laughed. "What? Master Fan, are you worried that I will get Fan Xian drunk?" "Then follow me," Fan Xian said from the side. As they spoke, Fan Xian's carriage drove over. Li Hongqing was just letting the prince's attendant bring the horse over. He turned his head and asked curiously, "What? Do you still only want to ride in a carriage and not on a horse?" "I'm not in a hurry," said Fan Xian. "Why would I ride a horse?" Li Hongqing couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. "If it weren't for the fact that the people of the capital know that you are skilled in both literature and martial arts, I'm afraid they would look down on you and think you are just a useless scholar without the strength to truss a chicken." The Qing kingdom revered martial arts. Young people were proud of being good at riding, but Fan Xian did the opposite. When there was a carriage, he refused to ride a horse. This strange habit had long spread throughout Jingdo this year. Fan Xian laughed and scolded him. He walked towards the carriage and said, "Riding a horse hurts my butt." The guards of King Jing's manor had already surrounded them. Together with the guards and servants of Fan Manor, they formed a small group of a dozen or so people. They surrounded a large horse and an unremarkable black carriage, slowly heading east of the city. There was no curfew in Jingdo. Although it was already dusk, there were still many people on the street. Seeing this eye-catching group, seeing the handsome young man on the horse, and seeing the square insignia on the carriage, they knew who the two people were. The people of Jingdo all knew of the diplomatic mission's return. Since they were traveling with Crown Prince Jing, they assumed that the person in the carriage was the legendary illegitimate child of the Fan family, Sir Fan Jr. They couldn't help but stop and watch. Some of the bolder students even called out to the carriage, "Immortal fan of poetry, immortal fan of poetry." Last year's banquet in front of the palace hall had been talked about by the people of Jingdo for a long time. and this time, Zhuang Mohan's gift of a book in Northern Qi, with the intentional help of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, had become a well-known anecdote. Fan Xian's reputation had taken another step forward. Later, the poem, Do You Know? Later, when the poem, Immortal of Poetry, began to spread, the people learned that Sir Fan Jr. had dared to flirt with Grandmaster Ku He's female disciple in Shangjing, Northern Qi, in front of countless young nobles of Northern Qi. Every time the people of Jingdo thought of this, they felt their hearts grow hotter. It was as if this matter was even more glorious than Zhuang Mohan's gift of a book. The begonia that you worship like a saint, in the hands of Sir Fan Jr., is no more than a flower bud waiting to be plucked. Fan Xian had brought face to the people of Jingdo, and naturally the people of Jingdo had to bring face to Sir Fan Jr. Along the way, people constantly greeted Fan Xian on the street. Most of them were scholars. Occasionally, there would be a girl with a shy expression bowing to him. Sir Fan Jr. had won the hearts of the people of Jingdo. Naturally, the people of Jingdo had overlooked Crown Prince Jing, even though he was the most arrogant person in the capital. However, Crown Prince Jing's face did not show any displeasure. On the contrary, he smiled happily. It seemed that the respect Fan Xian received was also his honor. Listening to the chatter and greetings outside the carriage, it was reasonable to say that Fan Xian, at this moment, would not open the window and wave his hand in greeting like the chief of his previous life. At the very least, there should be a satisfied smile on his face. But who would have thought that inside the carriage, there was only a helpless, bitter smile on his lips? The place the Crown Prince had arranged for Fan Xian to receive him was still Yishir Tavern. It was the restaurant where Fan Xian had spoken of his strength of character when he had first arrived in the capital. This restaurant could be considered a luxurious place in Jingdo, but it was not quiet enough. It was far from the best restaurant. Fan Xian couldn't help but not understand why Hongqing would choose such a place, but he didn't have any objections. When he got off the carriage, he realized that Yishir Tavern was unexpectedly quiet. There were not many people on the long street in front of the building, and the usually bustling building was even quieter. Fortunately, the building was brightly lit. Otherwise, he would have wondered if, in the months that he had been away, this second-to-none golden restaurant might have closed because of business failure. Seeing the doubt in the corner of Fan Xian's eyes, Li Hongqing did not deliberately mystify him. He smiled and said, "I'll take care of everything today." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "Although you are a great crown prince, this is too much of a scene. Who knows how many high officials and nobles come and go to Yishir Tavern every day? For the sake of inviting me to dinner, you have caused others to suffer. I'm afraid they will be jealous. If you want peace and quiet, there are many places in the west of the city. Even if you like the taste here, you can reserve a whole floor. To have an entire restaurant waiting for the two of us is too ostentatious. Even if King Jing doesn't scold you, it won't be good if word gets out to the palace." Li Hongqing saw the sincerity in Fan Xian's words, and looked at him for a moment without saying anything. He felt touched and smiled. "What are you afraid of? I'm afraid everyone in the world knows that my father loves to grow flowers, and I love to pluck them. I've always been impulsive. I can't get rid of the title of a licentious crown prince. What does it matter?" Fan Xian knew that, given his status, he could afford to put on such airs. He smiled and shook his head. "You're about to get married, and you don't know how to restrain yourself." Hearing him talk about marriage, Li Hongqing's face showed a faint joy, but he was a bit embarrassed to talk about it. "Don't be too careful," he said. "You have a lot of power in your hands and you've married a good wife. Let me be frank with you. In the palace and the manor, we of the younger generation have to know our limit. But once we leave the palace and the manor, we are the real masters. Let other people talk." These words were impulsive, exaggerated, and arrogant, but coming from Li Hongqing's mouth, they didn't provoke disgust. Fan Xian had been suppressing a bellyful of boredom in the palace, so he just smiled and followed Li Hongqing into the building. When they reached the bottom of the building, they saw the words Esher Tavern written by Sir Pan Ling himself. Li Hongqing stopped and pointed. "Do you remember where we first met?" he asked. Fan Xian smiled. "It's here." Yes, in just a short span of a year, you, the person who made such harsh remarks and repeatedly said that you looked down on so-called gifted scholars, has now become the most famous great scholar in the world. Li Hongqing couldn't help but shake his head and laugh. If you could think of the great Zhuang Mohan passing on his legacy to you, would you still be in the mood to scold those scholars? Fan Xian thought of the events of the past year, and he couldn't help but feel a little sentimental. He sighed. "I don't care if you laugh at me, but at the time, I was just an illegitimate child who had just arrived in the capital. I had never seen anything, so I couldn't help but have a few baskets of complaints." Li Hongqing looked at him with a smile. He knew that the reason why this young friend of his had changed so much in a year was because of the Emperor's favor, Minister Fan's secret protection, and a marriage alliance. But for him to become the commissioner of the Overwatch Council at such a young age, and to have a seat in the royal study, it would have been impossible without some real talent. Furthermore, the Banxian's High Poetry Anthology had appeared several times, and that was proof for all to see. As for the duties of the Overwatch Council, the nobles in the capital didn't actually connect Chen Pingping with Fan Xian. They just thought that it was the Emperor's will, and that Chen Pingping, that loyal dog, was simply following orders. "Although you always drag me around Lujing River, I don't rely on my talent to fool poor women." Fan Xian looked at the startled Li Hongqing, and laughed as he patted him on the shoulder. "So I still have to scold those *T scholars." In his heart, Haitang, who had been fooled by his poetry, was not a poor woman. The two of them stood in front of Esher Tavern, reminiscing about the past and feeling deeply moved. Inside the tavern, the shopkeepers and waiters were extremely nervous. Although they didn't know how the owner had managed to invite the Crown Prince to hold a welcoming banquet here, if Sir Fan Jr.'s first meal after returning to the capital was at Esher Tavern, not only would the reputation of the tavern go up a notch, but in the future, rich scholars from Jiangnan would all pick this place to eat. Wouldn't that be a waste of money? Although Esher Tavern was already famous enough, who would complain about having more of these three things: fame, power, and money? Fortunately, they didn't have to be nervous for long. Li Hongqing and Fan Xian had already walked into the tavern, arm in arm. The guards from the prince's manor, who had been guarding the two ends of the street behind them, immediately withdrew and stood guard at the entrance of the tavern. At the same time, waiters had already led Fan Manor's carriages and attendants elsewhere. With a creak, the door to Esher Tavern closed. This was probably the first time in the 34 years since the tavern opened in the capital. As the door closed, Li Hongqing seemed to inadvertently turn his head, and his sharp eyes discovered a few secret agents in ordinary clothing, occupying important areas around the tavern. He knew that they were the Overwatch Council's personal bodyguards, but even he wasn't sure which bureau they were from. The Crown Prince sighed to himself and said to Fan Xian, "And you say I'm arrogant? You have the Overwatch Council guarding your door when you eat, and the Tiger Guards protecting you when you go on diplomatic missions. When it comes to arrogance, I really can't compare to you." At that moment, the two of them had already ascended the stairs to the third floor. Separated by two screens, a small round table was already set up with a few plates of exquisite cold noodles. Fan Xian didn't stand on ceremony with him. He sat down on a stool and explained, "The Tiger Guards are assigned to the diplomatic mission, and they were taken back when we returned to the capital. As for the Overwatch Council..." He laughed bitterly. "After the Nyolan Street incident, do you think the council would dare to let me wander around the capital alone?" At this point, Li Hongqing pretended to be angry and scolded him. "You're not a good person, kid. You quietly became the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Seeing how nervous the council was after the Nyolan Street incident, I think you were all ready. If it weren't for the incident at the Ministry of Justice, I would still be in the dark. Thinking about it, during the Nyolan Street incident, Fan Xian hadn't alerted the Emperor with his one night of poetry. The Crown Prince was actually trying to get information out of him. It wasn't just him. Even the second prince couldn't completely understand why the Emperor trusted Fan Xian so much. Fan Xian didn't explain. He wiped his hands with a hot towel and began to drink, saying that he had been away for so long that he had forgotten the taste of wine in the capital. Li Hongqing laughed bitterly. He knew that Fan Xian wouldn't explain. Not long after, the first round of dishes arrived. Knowing that the Crown Prince and Sir Fan Jr. had something to say, the waiters tactfully said nothing more and left. Fan Xian used the tip of his chopsticks to slice off a piece of fish belly and put it into his mouth. He smacked it a few times and drank a mouthful of wine. He seemed to be enjoying it to the extreme. Li Hongqing looked him up and down and laughed. Instead of eating a first-rate bear paw, you make life difficult for a fish. You still can't escape your narrow-mindedness. Fan Xian blurted out, "The bear paw is what I want, and the fish is what I want. If I can't have both, I have to give up the bear paw and take the fish." Hearing his amusing words, Li Hongqing laughed. "Why?" Fan Xian slapped his head and laughed. "You don't understand. It's purely because you were too pedantic in your studies. Since it was a welcoming banquet, it shouldn't have been so deserted." But Fan Xian had already sent a message last night, asking the Crown Prince not to bring a large group of people to accompany him on the arduous journey. In addition, the Crown Prince faintly knew that because of the song, Fan Xian's backyard was on fire, so he didn't call for the singers to accompany him. But Li Hongqing was also a son of an influential family who was used to treating people gently. The two of them were familiar with each other. They talked about what they had seen in northern Qi, chatted, drank, and ate. It was light but satisfying. Fan Xian could finally be 70% his true self. On the contrary, he ate with great ease. After a few rounds of drinking, the Crown Prince couldn't take it anymore. He pointed at Fan Xian and scolded him. "I heard that you drank in northern Qi and got drunk as soon as you drank. How come you're a wine immortal in front of me?" Fan Xian was a master of medicine, and the zhenqi in his body was tyrannical. He couldn't be made drunk by a few cups of wine. Last time in northern Qi, when he was drinking with Haidang, he got drunk because he wanted to vent his years of depression. Hearing Li Hongqing's words, he laughed. "You're a man. What good is it for me to get drunk in front of you?" Li Hongqing suddenly looked fascinated. "That Haidang girl, is she really as beautiful as a fairy?" he asked quietly. Fan Xian spat out a mouthful of wine. Fortunately, he spat it out quickly and it only hit the ground. He laughed and scolded him. "Could it be that you invited me to dinner today just to say this?" After 3 rounds of drinking, Fan Xian's eyes grew brighter and brighter. Li Hongqing became drunk. He pointed at Fan Xian's delicate face and said, "Fan Xian, I don't know what happened to you on this trip. Looking at your face now, it's a bit different." Fan Xian unconsciously touched his face. "What's different?" he asked curiously. Li Hongqing scratched his head and spilled wine all over the floor. It seemed that he was thinking about how to phrase it. After a while, he laughed loudly. "If you were in the past, you would have a faint smile like you do now. You would make people want to get close to you, but there would always be a barrier, as if you didn't want others to get too close to you. But now, your smile doesn't have that purposeful purity. It just makes people feel at ease and their eyes are clear. Whether it's your speech or your actions, it's like a polished piece of jade, incomparably warm." Fan Xian smiled, fitting the scene perfectly. He thought that this was probably the change that night in the cave had brought to him. He finally understood some things. From the depths of his heart, he began to see himself as a part of this world. He began to make real plans for his future. Starting from the inside and showing it on the outside, there would naturally be changes. Li Hongqing gradually became drunk, but Fan Xian was incomparably sober. I know. Today, the palace has decided that you'll be in charge of the palace treasury. Li Hongqing seemed a little drunk. In the future, you'll have to leave some soup in your hands for me. Although it was a naughty joke, for him to say it as a prince was already giving Fan Xian enough face. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a little surprised. He looked at him and quietly asked, "Your family is a hereditary nobility. Why do you care about these things? Do you think the emperor owes you anything?" Li Hongqing had a mocking expression on his face. He stuck out his tongue and said, "You know I spend a lot. Even though there is a shopkeeper in Qingyu Hall helping the manor manage its finances, and there is some income, it is not enough." He sighed. "You also know that even though my brother is the emperor's blood brother, he has not been willing to do anything all these years. Even when he enters the palace to see grandmother, it is only once a month. He is very stubborn. As an idle king, naturally there are not many people who show filial piety. And because of my status, it's not good for me to put down my pride and interact with those governors. Naturally, there will be times when I don't have the time." Fan Xian seemed a little surprised. He didn't know what to say. If this was said outside, no one would believe it. Li Hongqing waved his hand. The smell of alcohol permeated the air. He laughed coldly. "An empty title of nobility is useless. You don't need to be embarrassed. The palace treasury belongs to the court. When it's time for you to fish, don't be shy. Think about all these years my aunt has been managing the palace treasury. Who knows how much the crown prince has benefited from it? Even when the Guo family was raided by you, they took 130,000 liang of silver. The palace treasury is empty? If you go to the crown prince's palace in Wuzhou, you'll know where the people's blood and sweat went." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew that the prince's words were specifically meant for him to hear. Looking at Crown Prince Jing, drunk on the table, Fan Xian smiled coldly. It seemed that Uncle Wu Zhu was right. There was no one in this world worth trusting. On the trip to northern Qi, he had many feelings. He knew that friendship was hard to come by. Even though he knew that Li Hongqing was using the excuse of welcoming him to represent the second prince in announcing his close relationship with the second prince to the capital, he still didn't refuse. But he didn't expect the crown prince to tell such a big lie in front of him. Li Hongqing, Crown Prince Jing, was one of Fan Xian's trusted subordinate. He had been secretly managing all the flesh business on Lujing River. Although it wasn't a glorious business and didn't seem to match the crown prince's status, it provided him with a steady stream of silver. The crown prince's actions were extremely secretive. If Fan Xian hadn't sent people to investigate Yuan Meng last summer, perhaps even the second bureau of the Overwatch Council wouldn't know about this matter. No wonder he dared to cry poor in front of Fan Xian. But Fan Xian also knew that the second prince wasn't necessarily interested in the money in the palace treasury. It was just that while the eldest princess of Xinyang was at the helm, the Eastern Palace must have done a lot of work in the palace treasury. Perhaps the second prince was relying on Fan Xian and wanted to use this to topple the crown prince. And he also understood that there was truth in the crown prince's words. There were indeed some nobles who didn't live as they pleased. Even Fan Xian himself, if he didn't have the support of the bookstore and the head steward of the national treasury, would have to stretch out his hands everywhere. Without anyone to show him respect, did he have to rely on the government's salary? The banquet was over and the wine was finished. Fan Xian patted Li Hongqing twice. Seeing no reaction, he didn't care whether Li Hongqing was really drunk or just pretending to be drunk. He pretended to stagger, stood up, and walked out. The innkeeper had already informed the attendants on both sides to wait on him. The wooden door of Esher Tavern opened, and the early autumn wind blew in. Fan Xian shook his head. He tried to treat his friend with sincerity, but there was no response. He couldn't help but feel disappointed. At that moment, a plainly dressed middle-aged man appeared out of nowhere, and bowed to Fan Xian in fear and trepidation. Fan Xian turned slightly and frowned. If Li Hongqing had booked the entire tavern, and there were guards outside, how did this man get in? The man saw the confusion on Fan Xian's face, and hurriedly replied humbly, "I am Cui Qingchuan, the owner of Yisher Tavern." "Greetings, Master Fan." So it was the owner of Yisher Tavern. He had probably come to flatter Fan Xian. Fan Xian was about to smile when he suddenly remembered the family name. "Cui?" he asked, frowning. Cui Qingchuan carefully smiled. "That's right. The elders of the clan wanted to come and thank you for your kindness in teaching the second son in the north. But they know that Master Fan is a scholar, and doesn't like to do things like this, so they ordered me to serve you well today." Fan Xian nodded expressionlessly. He knew that the Cui clan was a famous family with roots in the capital. They did business in the north, and Master Cui, who had knelt in the rainy night of the diplomatic mission and begged for his life, was one of them. Presumably, the Cui clan knew that their son had offended Fan Xian, and so they had done everything they could to smooth things over. Cui Qingchuan tactfully did not step forward. He only handed over a box. "This is a dwarf ginseng. Although it's not very nutritious, it's best used to sober up a hangover. It's been washed, and it's best to chew it raw." Fan Xian nodded, and Ting Zijing took it from him. In the carriage, Fan Xian opened the box on his knees. There was no dwarf ginseng, but a thick stack of banknotes. He frowned and flipped it over. There were 20,000 taels of silver in it. Ting Zijing sat across from him and said, dumbfounded, "The Cui clan is very generous." Fan Xian's expression did not change, but he was actually a little surprised. This was the income of Donbo bookstore, and yet they had delivered it so easily. Of course, he also understood that if the Cui clan still wanted to do business in the north with the palace treasury, they would have to curry favor with him. Thinking of the courteous treatment he had received on his way out of the palace, he couldn't help but sigh. Although he had lived 2 lives, and his temperament was much firmer than that of the average person, at this moment, he truly felt the feeling of power, and he felt a little lost. But the Cui clan had given him this money for nothing. Since Fan Xian had already made up his mind, in the future, the Cui clan would only be able to accompany the eldest princess in death. Thinking of this, his dislike for the crown prince lessened a little. After all, people only had one life, and in the end they were just using each other. But he did not like that Li Hongqing treated him like a fool, and in the end, he still wanted to keep this friend. Ting Zijing looked at the young master's face and knew what he was thinking. He frowned. "Is this appropriate?" Fan Xian looked at him and smiled. "The crown prince gave me a sentence earlier. After leaving the palace and the manor, I am a true lord. What is inappropriate about that?" The carriage arrived at a secluded alley. The moon in the sky was near its zenith, and its silvery light was soft. Fan Xian got off the carriage, and let the people of the manor return first. Ting Zijing knew that Fan Xian was secretly protected by a team of Overwatch Council officials, so he said nothing. He waved at a shadow, and an Overwatch Council secret agent quietly walked over. He was also in the first batch of people from the Qinian unit, and could be considered Fan Xian's closest confidant. Fan Xian looked at him. "Deng Ziyue, tomorrow, send a secret order back to the council. Investigate the Minister of Appointments, the Imperial Astronomer, and the Deputy Imperial Messenger of the Left. See if they have anything to do with the Cui clan's businesses." Deng Ziyue suddenly raised his head. His eyes were wide and bright. "Sir, without an edict, we cannot investigate the royal family." His rank in the Overwatch Council was extremely high, so he vaguely knew that behind these 3 officials was the second prince. Fan Xian frowned and waved his hand. It's just a few officials secretly investigating. What are you afraid of? Deng Ziyuan knew that his performance had already dissatisfied the commissioner, and he hurriedly agreed. Fan Xian looked at him and added, Wang Qinian knows what to ask and what not to ask. Since you have taken over his position, you must learn this. Deng Ziyue fearfully accepted the order. Then he saw a box suddenly appear in front of him. He didn't dare open it, so he could only hold it in his arms and walk with Fan Xian, who was strolling with his hands behind his back. Finally, he gathered his courage and asked, Sir, from now on, how can I contact the council? He didn't know if this was something he should ask. Fan Xian stopped walking and smiled. Don't go through the official channels. That will be recorded. Go directly to Mu Tai of the First Bureau. Yes. Fan Xian walked forward. It was rare for him to appreciate the capital late at night after a long absence. He didn't want to let go of this opportunity, so he only said one sentence. This box is not for you. It's for you. Chapter 263. The nights in the capital were quieter than those in Shangjing, northern Qi. The people of the Qin kingdom were not used to the so-called Golden Age, so most of the time they were used to staying at home at night. Of course, the pleasure boats on the Lujing River and the brothels in the west of the city were not included. Fan Xian put his hands behind his back and walked slowly through the night. Deng Ziyu held a box and followed a few steps behind him. Suddenly, Fan Xian stopped and waved his hand toward the darkness in front of and behind him. The Overwatch Council officials hidden in the darkness responsible for his safety revealed themselves somewhat unknowingly. Everyone in the capital knows you are by my side. Why deliberately stay in the dark? Fan Xian said with a smile. Deng Ziyu explained with a wry smile. The court officials do not like to see the Overwatch Council spies on the streets. The common people are also afraid. I'm afraid it will have a bad effect on you, sir. Fan Xian understood what he meant. He smiled and said, You always walk on people's roof. Aren't you afraid you'll disturb people's sleep? The subordinates looked at each other, but they followed Commissioner Fan's orders and came to the street. These people were all officials who had not been very successful in the Overwatch Council. When Wang Qinian was ordered to form the Qinian unit, he had put in a lot of thought and found people who were suitable. Now that the people of the Qinian unit were following Commissioner Fan, it could be said that they were riding on the crest of success in the council. No matter which of the 8 bureaus they went to do business with, they were always respectful. Furthermore, other than their monthly salary, they also received a large allowance. This kind of change made them feel that following Commissioner Fan was a very fortunate thing. It was near the middle of the night, and the temperature was dropping. Deng Ziyu hurried forward a few steps and put a thin black windbreaker on Fan Xian's body. He then immediately returned to his position. A group of 7 or 8 people walked forward. Everyone wore the black unlined clothing that the Overwatch Council had specially made. The hem was above the knee. The material did not reflect much light, and it gave off a gloomy feeling. Under the moonlight, the group maintained a very meaningful distance. Silently and synchronously, they surrounded Fan Xian in the center and walked forward. The silver light was like snow, and the black clothes were like ink. The next day, Fan Xian went to the building next to Tianhe Avenue, the Overwatch Council. As he walked in, calm-faced officials of the Overwatch Council bowed to him. Good morning, Commissioner Fan. Good morning, Commissioner Fan. He smiled and responded to them one by one. Without stopping, he walked towards the room at the back of the courtyard. He pushed the door open and found that the 7 heads of the 8 bureaus were all present. Fan Xian bowed slightly and cupped his hands in salute to the crowd. The 7 leaders did not dare to be arrogant and quickly stood up to return the salute. Yen Ruahai of the 4th Bureau, in particular, looked at Fan Xian with an expression of joy and gratitude. It seemed that he had spent the past 2 days at home with Yan Bingyun and his son, and was in a good mood. Only Chen Pingping, sitting in the wheelchair at the end of the long table, looked at him with a faint smile. He coughed and sat on the seat to the right of Chen Pingping. He was somewhat surprised to not see his teacher. As if guessing what he was thinking, Chen Pingping gently rubbed his knees and said in a slightly sharp voice, "He went to Jiangnan to have fun. I can't control him." Fan Xian smiled and lowered his voice. "Looking ahead," he said, "when are you going out to play?" Chen Pingping glanced at him and said, "That depends on when you have the ability to take over." The Overwatch Council rarely held these kinds of meetings, and Fan Xian had coincidentally run into them both times he came. Of course, these 2 meetings were inextricably linked to him. After listening to Fan Xian's report on his trip to Northern Qi, the officials all relaxed. As long as the spy network in the north had not been fatally destroyed, nothing else mattered. As for Fan Xian nominating Wang Qinian to temporarily handle affairs in the north, no one had much objection. For one, Fan Xian had this power as commissioner. Secondly, Wang Qinian had been in the council for a long time. If he had not failed to live up to expectations in the beginning, he was afraid that by now he would also be a leader. Since he had coincidentally followed Commissioner Fan, it was not out of line for Commissioner Fan to promote one of his own up a rank. Third, the business in the north was a dangerous one. Just look at what happened to the son of the Yen family in the 4th Bureau. But the following announcement of the council's personnel arrangements was somewhat unexpected. The officials of the council had always thought that after Zhu Gu of the 1st Bureau committed suicide, the position that had been left empty, and the reason why the director had not called for anyone to take over was because he wanted to wait for Yan Bingyun to return to the country. Unexpectedly, the director announced that Yan Bingyun would be appointed as the head of the 4th Bureau. If he went to the 4th Bureau, who would be in charge of the 1st Bureau? What about Sir Yen Ruai? Chen Pingping raised his eyes weakly and said, "Ruahai has been in the council for too long. He is a bit tired of it, so he has asked to resign from his position in the 4th Bureau. Tomorrow, he will send a letter to the Ministry of Appointments and find a position in the capital to enjoy his retirement." From the looks of it, Chen Pingping was not very happy about Yen Ruahai's voluntary resignation. But Yen Ruahai had been worried about his son's life every day for the past year and was actually somewhat tired of life in the council. In addition, he knew that the council's 8 bureaus could not allow 2 heads of the Yen family to appear at the same time. In order to make room for Yan Bingyun, he could only rush to resign first. The heads of the Overwatch Council's 8 bureaus did not seem to have a high rank, but in reality, they held great power in their hands. Even the vice-ministers of the various ministries did not dare to offend them. Fan Xian looked at Yen Ruahai and found that the corners of his eyes were indeed a bit tired, but there was also a hint of relief and joy. Since the director and Sir Yen had already made arrangements for the 4th Bureau, no one said anything more. At that moment, the head of the 2nd Bureau asked, "The position of the 1st Bureau has been empty for so long, someone has to take care of it. Mu Tai." He shook his head and said, "His loyalty is unparalleled, but he only knows how to flatter. His ability is still a bit weak. The 1st Bureau is one of the most important departments in the Council, and it is in charge of supervising the officials in the capital." The other chiefs also nodded in agreement. The 1st Bureau was the brightest position among the 8 bureaus. Since these bosses of the 8 bureaus did not retreat bravely like Yen Ruahai, they naturally all wanted to advance further. Chen Pingping slowly turned his head and looked at Fan Xian, who still had a suspicious look on his face. He said, "From today onwards, there will be no head of the 1st Bureau. Commissioner Fan will have full authority to manage it." These words were spoken lightly, but they carried a heavy weight in the hearts of everyone present. Immediately, the desire to fight for power in their hearts was completely dispelled. No one dared to fight with Commissioner Fan. He had always been their superior, and it was clear that he would one day take over from Director Chen. Now that he was in charge of the First Bureau, who dared to say anything? But everyone's hearts were filled with awe. The power of the Commissioner was already limited, and now that Sir Fan was in charge of the First Bureau, the affairs of the First Bureau would no longer need to be personally arranged by the Council. Instead, the other departments would have to cooperate with the First Bureau. In this way, the status of the First Bureau would probably increase by half a level. In other words, Commissioner Fan was the ruler of the First Bureau. Whatever he said, the First Bureau would do. Fan Xian was also a bit surprised. Why would Chen Pingping want him to manage the First Bureau? He turned to look at him and said, "Director, I am already very reluctant to be the commissioner. I have never handled any specific affairs. If I were to suddenly manage the First Bureau, I am afraid it would not be of any benefit to the Council." Chen Pingping's words set the tone. "You have no experience with specific affairs, so I am giving you the First Bureau so that you can gain some experience." After the meeting ended, all the subordinates in the council congratulated Fan Xian. But the atmosphere of the Overwatch Council was better than that of the other departments in the court, so Fan Xian didn't hear too much flattery. As the officials left, Yen Ruohai stayed behind and expressed his thanks to Fan Xian. Fan Xian felt a bit ashamed of himself. He quickly smiled and said, "Bingyun and I felt like old friends when we first met. Besides, it was all council business. I really didn't do much." "Please don't say that, Sir Yen. I am ashamed." Yen Ruohai saw that Fan Xian did not take credit for himself, and admired the young nobleman even more. He smiled and patted Fan Xian on the shoulder. "In a few days, I will send an invitation for Master Fan to visit us." Of course. Fan Xian wouldn't refuse. He also wondered what Lady Shen was like in Yen Manor. Only Chen Pingping and Fan Xian were left in the room. Nonsense Station. Chen Pingping frowned and looked at him. "I know that Bingyun is a calm child, and would never bring that woman back to the capital. I think it was all your idea." Everyone was afraid of Chen Pingping, but Fan Xian always laughed and played the role of a junior in front of him. After complaining about being wronged, he said, "Director, this has nothing to do with me. When Lady Shen entered the diplomatic mission, she stayed in the eldest princess carriage the entire time. I couldn't forcibly drag her down and kill her." Chen Pingping narrowed his eyes. "On the way back to the capital, I had the Black Knights follow the diplomatic mission. If it weren't for your instructions, how could that woman have charged into the diplomatic mission alone?" Fan Xian didn't know how to explain. After a while, he sighed. At least it wasn't an ill-fated relationship. Chen Pingping loved this young man dearly, and he couldn't bear to reprimand him. "Why did you have the Chinian unit reveal their whereabouts?" Fan Xian knew he couldn't hide this from him, and he had already thought of an answer. He smiled and said, "Because I wanted the council to be more open and aboveboard. There was no need to always hide in the dark and make so many people afraid of us." "Open and aboveboard?" Chen Pingping frowned. "It's good that you have such thoughts." Fan Xian pulled up the blanket on his knees and said quietly, "Take your time. There's no rush. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.